I got divorced and moved overseas to escape a life of ungratefulness, only for my ex-wife to marry her new guy right away. My son told me he would be the best man, and then he added, "He is a good, wealthy man." Not like you, Dad. But during the wedding, a guest said one line that made my ex-wife lose her mind, and then she called me begging for help. She did not know that the man she discarded was holding the keys to her entire future. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Lucius Freeman, and I am 68 years old, sitting on the terrace of my villa in the Algarve, Portugal. I looked out at the Atlantic Ocean, the morning sun hitting the white waves, while my finger hovered over an iPad screen with a single tap. I authorized a $50 million acquisition, expanding my logistics empire into 3 new European ports. To the world, I was a ghost, a retired laborer who had faded into obscurity. But in reality, I was the silent owner of one of the largest supply chains on the East Coast. I took a sip of vintage port wine, savoring the silence, a silence that was shattered by the vibration of my phone on the marble table. The screen lit up with a name I had not heard from in months. Terrence, my son. I hesitated before answering. I knew this was not a courtesy call. Terrence never called to ask how my arthritis was or if I was enjoying my retirement. He only called when he needed something or when he wanted to remind me of my failures as a father. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. Silence hung on the line for a moment before his voice cut through, sharp and impatient. "Dad, are you in the States?" he asked, without a hello. "I am in Portugal, Terrence," I replied, keeping my voice calm and low. The Atlantic breeze was cool, but the sudden heat in my chest was familiar. "I have been here for 3 months. You need to come back," he demanded, his tone shifting from inquiry to command. "Mom is getting married on Saturday." The words hung in the salty air like a bad smell. Dolores and I had been divorced for exactly 90 days. 30 years of marriage dissolved in a courtroom. Because she claimed I lacked ambition. She wanted a high life. I refused to give her on credit. Now she was remarrying before the ink on our divorce papers was even dry. "That is fast," I said, taking another sip of wine. "I wish her the best. Send her a toaster from me." "No, Dad." "You do not understand," Terrence interrupted, his voice rising. "You need to be at the wedding." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that startled a seagull perched on the railing. "Why on earth would I do that?" "Terrence, I am the ex-husband. I am the last person who should be there." "Because of optics, Dad," Terrence said, and I could hear the sneer in his voice. "We are trying to keep this classy. Byron is a prominent man in the community. He has business partners flying in from all over. Mom does not want people whispering that you are bitter or hiding in a hole somewhere because you could not keep her." Byron Sinclair. I knew the name. He was a flash in the pan, a man who wore suits that were too shiny and drove leased cars. He called himself a real estate developer, but in my circles we called men like him bottom feeders. "I am not bitter, Terrence. I am relieved," I said, looking at the vast ocean that separated me from their toxicity, "and I am certainly not hiding." "Then prove it. Come to the wedding show, everyone. You are fine with it. Besides, Byron wants you there," he says. "He holds no ill will. He is a generous man. Dad, not petty like you." The insult landed with a dull thud. Generous petty for 30 years. I played a role. I drove trucks. I wore work boots stained with grease and oil. I came home tired, and I put every spare dollar into a trust fund for my family. I wanted Terrence to see the value of hard work. I wanted Dolores to love me for the man I was, not the bank account I could provide. I had played the part of the blue-collar provider so well that they actually believed it. They looked at my calloused hands and saw failure. I looked at my bank statements and saw freedom. "He is generous, is he?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "He paid off Mom's credit card debt last week," Terrence said, dropping the information like a bomb. $20,000, just like that snap of his fingers. Something you could never do in 30 years. He is taking care of her, Dad, the way a real man should. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I had paid off those credit cards secretly 3 times in the last decade. I had just never taken the credit because I did not want to shame Dolores. Now this charlatan was buying their affection with money he likely borrowed. If he is so perfect, then he does not need me there to validate him, I said, preparing to hang up. I am not flying across the ocean to watch a circus. Wait, Terrence shouted, and then his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Look, Courtney, and I talked about it. We know you might feel out of place with Byron's crowd. These are high net worth individuals, dad, investors, bankers, people who matter, so to make it easier for you. Courtney arranged for you to sit at a specific table. Courtney, my daughter-in-law. A woman who smiled with her teeth but never her eyes. A woman who once asked me to park my truck down the street when she had friends over so it would not lower the property value of the house I bought for them. Which table? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous register. Table 19, Terrence said quickly. It is near the service entrance. It is mostly Byron's former staff, some landscapers and the old nanny. You will feel more comfortable there. You can talk about, manual labor and things you understand. We just do not want you to feel awkward sitting with the executives. Silence stretched across the Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles of fiber optic cable humming with the weight of that insult they wanted me to fly back to America to watch my ex-wife marry a con artist, and they wanted to seat me by the kitchen door with the staff, so I would not embarrass them. They wanted the prop of the supportive ex-husband, but they wanted to hide the reality of the blue-collar worker. And Dad, Terrence added, delivering the final blow, please do not wear that old gray suit of yours, the one with the patches on the elbows. Courtney says it smells like diesel fuel. Just rent a tuxedo. Try to look like you belong, even if you don't. The rage did not explode. It crystallized it, turned into a cold, hard diamond in the center of my chest for years. I had tested them. I had waited for a spark of humility, a moment of gratitude, a sign that they valued the man over the material. I had waited in vain. They were not just blind. They were willfully cruel. I looked down at my iPad. The contract for $50 million was still waiting for my signature. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the sliding door, a 68-year-old, black man with white hair and a posture of steel. They thought I was a broken-down truck driver. They thought I was a cautionary tale. I will be there, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. Really? Terrence sounded surprised, as if he expected a fight. Yes, I said. Tell Courtney. I appreciate her thoughtfulness regarding the seating arrangements. I would not want to make the executives uncomfortable with my presence. Good choice, Dad, Terrence said, dismissing me finally. Doing something right for a change. See you Saturday. The line went dead. I placed the phone gently on the table next to the unfinished bottle of wine. I did not sign the contract. Not yet. Instead, I picked up the phone again and dialed a number that Terrence and Dolores did not know existed. The number of my personal assistant in New York. Ms. Davis, I said when she answered on the first ring. Mr. Freeman, how is Portugal? She asked efficiently. Beautiful, I said, but I need to leave. Prepare the Gulf Stream. I am flying home tonight, but Ms. Davis, this is important. Have the pilot land at the private airfield in Teterboro, not JFK, and arrange for a taxi to pick me up. Not the limousine, a regular yellow taxi with a dent in the bumper if possible. A taxi, sir? She asked, a hint of confusion in her professional demeanor. Yes, I said, standing up and walking to the edge of the balcony, staring west toward the horizon, toward America, toward the family that had just signed their own sentence. I have one last role to play. They want the truck driver, they want the failure, so I am going to give them the best performance of my life. I hung up the phone and looked at my clothes. Linen trousers, a silk shirt, handmade loafers. I would have to change. I went to the back of my closet where I kept a small box of old things. I pulled out a faded watch with a scratched face and a suit I had bought at a thrift store 15 years ago, the very suit Courtney hated. I ran my thumb over the fabric, feeling the rough texture they wanted to sit me with, the help they wanted to hide me in the corner. They wanted to use me as a prop to elevate their own fragile egos. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Saturday was not going to be a wedding. It was going to be a funeral for their illusions, and I was going to be the one holding the shovel. I walked back to the table, signed the $50 million contract with a flourish of my finger, and closed the iPad. The truck driver was coming home, and he was bringing a storm with him. The yellow taxi came to a screeching halt in front of Le Jardin, the most pretentious French restaurant in the city. I paid the driver in cash and stepped onto the sidewalk, ignoring the disdainful look of the valet, who was busy parking a line of leased Mercedes and BMWs. I smoothed the lapels of my suit. It was a charcoal gray wool suit cut in Milan 20 years ago, timeless and elegant to those who knew quality. But to the untrained eye of the nouveau riche, it was simply old and out of style. Exactly the impression I wanted to make. Walked toward the heavy oak doors, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm of anticipation. I was not here to celebrate. I was here to witness a farce. As I reached the entrance, a manicured hand shot out, blocking my path. It was Courtney, my daughter-in-law. She stood there in a cocktail dress that cost more than my supposed monthly pension. Her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that pulled at the skin around her eyes. She looked me up and down, her nose wrinkling slightly as if she had just caught a whiff of rotting garbage. "Dad," she hissed, her voice low and sharp. "What are you wearing? I told Terrence to tell you to rent a tuxedo. This is a VIP event, not a union meeting." I looked down at my suit, allowing my shoulders to slump slightly, playing the part of the chastised old man. "It is my best suit, Courtney," I said softly. "I wore it to church when your mother-in-law and I renewed our vows 10 years ago." She rolled her eyes, a gesture so disrespectful it made my fingers itch to sign a disinheritance document right then and there. "It smells like mothballs and failure," she whispered, leaning in close so the hostess would not hear. "Listen to me. Lucius, do not embarrass us tonight. These are important people. Byron has invited. Investors do not speak unless spoken to. And for God's sake, keep your voice down. Your booming bass carries and it scares the clientele. Just sit there, eat your soup, and try to look invisible." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the floor, swallowing the retort that burned in my throat. I wanted to tell her that this suit was tailored by the same man who dressed the Italian Prime Minister. I wanted to tell her that my booming bass had commanded boardrooms in Tokyo and London, but I remained silent. Silence was my weapon tonight. Courtney turned on her heel and marched into the dining room, and I followed like an obedient dog. The private dining room was dripping with crystal chandeliers and gold leaf accents. It was tacky, ostentatious, and exactly the kind of place Dolores would think was the height of sophistication. My ex-wife sat at the head of the table next to an empty chair. She was wearing a dress that was too tight and too sparkly for a woman of 65. She looked like a disco ball that had fallen on hard times when she saw me. Her eyes narrowed. "You came," she said, her voice flat. "Terrence insisted," I replied, taking the seat. Courtney pointed to. It was at the far end of the table, right next to the swinging kitchen door, just as promised. And then the double doors burst open and the man of the hour arrived. Byron Sinclair. He was a large man, filling the doorway with his presence and his cologne, which smelled like musk and desperation. He wore a white suit with gold buttons, a fashion choice that went out of style in the 80s. His fingers were adorned with thick gold rings, and a heavy chain hung around his neck, resting on a chest exposed by an unbuttoned shirt. He strode into the room, arms wide, acting as if he owned the place. Though I knew, for a fact, he was renting the suit, the car, and probably his personality. "Byron, darling," Dolores cooed, standing up to kiss his cheek. Byron ignored her for a moment, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. He grinned a wide, predatory smile that showed too many teeth and walked straight toward me. "So, this is the famous Lucius," he boomed, his voice shaking the crystal glasses on the table. He grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard, trying to crush my knuckles in a childish display of dominance. I let my hand go limp, giving him the satisfaction of thinking I was weak. "Nice to meet you, Byron," I said quietly. He dropped my hand and then, in a move that made the blood freeze in my veins, he wiped his palm on his napkin, staring me dead in the eye while he did it. "Pleasure is all mine, old-timer," he said, laughing loudly, a sound that grated on my nerves. "Thank you for letting Dolores go. You know what they say. One man's trash is another man's treasure." Though looking at her now shining like a diamond, I would say you were the one who did not know how to polish her. The table erupted in polite, nervous laughter. Terrence chuckled, sipping his wine, avoiding my gaze. "I understand," Byron continued, pulling out his chair and sitting down heavily. "It is hard to keep a woman like Dolores happy on a truck driver's salary. Women like her need diamonds, not diesel fuel." I picked up my water glass and took a sip, letting the insult wash over me. He thought. I drove trucks because I had told Dolores I worked in logistics and occasionally came home with grease on my hands from fixing the engines of my fleet. I never corrected her assumption that I was the one driving them. You are very generous, I said, my voice neutral. I try, Byron said, puffing out his chest. I am a self-made man. Lucius, real estate, imports, exports. I dabble in everything. I know how the world works. Unlike some people who spend their lives looking at the rear end of a trailer. He reached for a bottle of wine, pouring himself a glass, and as he extended his arm, his sleeve rode up, revealing a watch on his thick wrist. I froze. It was a gold watch with a distinctive blue face and a small diamond at the 12 o'clock position. It was not a Rolex or a Patek Philippe. It was a custom-made timepiece I commissioned in 1998. I stared at it, my mind racing back 20 years that year. My company, Freeman Logistics, had broken its first $10 million in revenue to celebrate. I had 50 of those watches made for my top employees and drivers who had been with me since the beginning. I had designed them myself. I looked from the watch to Byron's face, trying to place him. He looked different, older, heavier. But there was something familiar about the set of his eyes, the way he held his fork. Then it clicked. Byron. Sinclair was not a real estate mogul. He was B.B. Sinclair, a junior dispatcher. I had fired in '99 for falsifying overtime logs and stealing petty cash. He had kept the watch, the severance gift I gave to everyone I let go during the restructuring that year. He was wearing my watch, a watch I gave him while he sat there insulting me. I lowered my gaze to my plate, hiding the small smile that threatened to form on my lips. This was better than I could have imagined. He was not just a con artist, he was a former employee, a failed one at that. The dinner dragged on, an endless parade of rich food and cheap conversation. Byron dominated the room, telling stories of deals that never happened and properties he did not own. Dolores hung on his every word, her eyes shining with greed and adoration. Terrence nodded along, asking for investment advice like a puppy begging for scraps. I ate my soup in silence, listening, observing, cataloging every lie. Finally, the waiter arrived with the bill. It came in a black leather folder, and he placed it discreetly in the center of the table. The chatter stopped suddenly. The air in the room grew heavy. Byron patted the breast pocket of his white suit, then his side pockets, then his pants pockets, his face contorted into a mask of exaggerated surprise. "Oh, damn," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "What is it, honey?" Dolores asked, touching his arm. "My wallet," Byron said, shaking his head. "I must have left it in the glove compartment of the Aston Martin. The valet parked it blocks away, and I do not have the ticket on me." He looked around the table, his eyes landing on me for a split second before sliding away. Dolores looked at the bill, then she looked at Byron, then slowly, inevitably she turned her head and looked at me. It was a reflex, born of 30 years of marriage. Whenever a bill arrived, whenever a pipe burst, whenever money was needed, she looked to Lucius. Lucius always fixed it. Lucius always paid. Even when we were supposedly poor, I always found a way. "Lucius," she said, her voice taking on that wheedling tone she used when she wanted something, since Byron forgot his wallet. "Maybe you could." She let the sentence hang in the air, expecting me to reach for my worn leather wallet, expecting me to sacrifice my dignity one last time to save her embarrassment, expecting the doormat to lie flat so they could wipe their feet. I looked at her. I looked at the woman I had loved for 3 decades, the woman who had left me, the moment she thought she found a bigger wallet. I looked at Byron, the thief wearing my watch. I looked at Terrence, who was studying the tablecloth. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice cubes clinked softly against the crystal, the sound echoing in the silent room. I placed the glass back down and folded my hands in my lap. I did not say a word. I did not move to reach for my pocket. I just sat there, a statue of indifference. The silence stretched thin and tight like a rubber band about to snap. "Dad." Terrence hissed, his face flushing red. "Come on, do not be like this. I am a guest." "Terrence," I said, my voice calm and steady, and as Courtney kindly pointed out, "I am on a fixed income. I barely have enough for the taxi home." Courtney let out a sound of pure frustration, a mix of a growl and a sigh. She glared at me, her eyes burning with hatred. "Fine," she snapped, slamming her hand down on the table. "I will get it." She snatched the leather folder, opening it and grimacing at the total. She dug into her purse, pulling out a credit card and throwing it onto the table with a force that made the silverware jump. "I cannot believe you," she muttered, looking at me with pure venom. You are unbelievable. You come here, eat their food, drink their wine, and you cannot even help out when there is a simple mistake. You are pathetic. Lucius, truly pathetic. I watched as the waiter took the card and walked away. Byron let out a sigh of relief, quickly recovering his composure. "Sorry about that, folks," he said, pouring himself more wine. "Embarrassing, really, but do not worry, Courtney. I will pay you back double tomorrow, first thing in the morning when the bank opens." "Of course, Byron," Courtney said, her voice changing instantly from hateful to syrupy. "Sweet, I know you will. I am happy to help family. Family." I thought, looking at the ring of faces around the table. They were not family. They were a pack of hyenas fighting over a carcass. But they did not realize the carcass was still alive, and it had teeth. I stood up, smoothing the front of my vintage suit. "Thank you for the meal," I said quietly. It was illuminating. "Where are you going?" Dolores asked, suspicious. "I have a long shift tomorrow," I lied. "I need to rest my old bones." Byron laughed, waving a hand dismissively. "Go on, then, truck driver, get your rest. Do not want you falling asleep at the wheel and killing someone." I walked toward the door, feeling their eyes on my back. I could hear them whispering as I left, giggling at my expense. As I pushed through the swinging doors, I glanced back one last time. Byron was raising his glass in a toast, the watch on his wrist catching the light. I stepped out into the cool night air, the humiliation rolling off me like water off a duck's back. They thought they had won. They thought they had shamed me, but all they had done was sign their own warrants. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my assistant again. "Ms. Davis," I said as I walked toward the waiting taxi. "Yes, Mr. Freeman. Get me the personnel files from 1998, specifically anyone terminated for theft. I need the full file on a B. Sinclair and Ms. Davis." "Yes, sir. Find out who holds the mortgage on the venue for the wedding tomorrow and buy it. Buy the debt, buy the note, buy the whole building if you have to. I want to be the one holding the keys when the doors open tomorrow morning." "Consider it done, sir." I climbed into the taxi and gave the driver the address of my hotel. "You look like you had a rough night, buddy," the driver said, looking at me in the rearview mirror. "On the contrary," I said, leaning back and closing my eyes, imagining the look on Byron's face when he realized who actually paid his salary all those years ago. "It was the best night I have had in years. The appetizer is finished tomorrow. We serve the main course." The morning sun beat down on the rented mansion, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn where rows of white chairs were being set up for the ceremony. I stood in the hallway outside the groomsman's suite, clutching a thick manila envelope in my hand. Inside that envelope was a bank book, a certified check, and a letter. It was a sum of $500,000. To a man of my actual means, $500,000 was a rounding error on a quarterly report. But to the man my son thought I was, it represented a lifetime of sacrifice. It was the money I had ostensibly saved by driving double shifts, by eating cold sandwiches in truck stop parking lots, by wearing the same boots until the soles wore through. I had prepared this gift not as a billionaire but as a father. I wanted to give Terrence a seed, a clean start capital to launch the business he always talked about but never started. I took a deep breath, smoothing the lapel of my vintage suit. I knew the odds were against me. I knew Terrence had been poisoned by Dolores' ambition, and Byron is fool gold. But a father, as hope is a stubborn thing, it persists even when all evidence suggests it should die. I knocked on the heavy oak door and pushed it open. The room smelled of hairspray and expensive scotch. Byron sat in a leather armchair holding a glass of amber liquid, looking like a man who had already won the lottery. Terrence was standing behind him, fussing with Byron. Bow tie, acting more like a valet than a stepson or a groom. "Dad," Terrence said, seeing me in the mirror, his hands freezing on Byron's tie. "You are here early. I came to see you, son," I said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind me. I ignored Byron, who merely raised his glass in a mocking salute and focused entirely on my boy. "You look good." Terrence turned around, smoothing his tuxedo jacket. "It is a custom fit, Dad." Byron S. Taylor flew in from Miami to adjust it. "Silk lapels, Italian wool, you would not know much about this kind of quality, but trust me, it is top tier." "I know quality, Terrence," I said softly, touching the envelope in my pocket. "I know that quality is not about the fabric, it is about the man inside the suit." Terrence sighed, rolling his eyes. "Listen, Dad, If you are here to give me some blue-collar speech about hard work and honest living, save it. I have a lot on my mind today. This is a big event. Important people are coming. I am not here to lecture you, I said, pulling the envelope from my inner pocket. I stepped forward, holding it out to him. I am here to give you something. I know we have had our differences. I know you think I did not aim high enough in life, but I saved this for you. It is everything I have put away for the last 30 years. It is seed money, Terrence, for that tech startup you wanted to build. Terrence looked at the envelope as if it were a dirty rag. He did not take it. He did not even reach for it. He just stared at my hand with a look of profound disappointment, mixed with amusement. "What is in there, Dad?" he asked, a sneer curling his lip. "A savings bond. A check for $500, maybe 1,000. Did you skip lunch for a year to scrape this together?" "It is $500,000, I said, my voice steady. The room went silent. Byron choked on his scotch, coughing violently. Terrence's eyes went wide for a second before he burst out laughing, a cruel, sharp sound that cut deeper than any knife. "500 grand, he wheezed, shaking his head. "You are hilarious." "Dad, really? You missed your calling. You should have been a comedian. Where would a truck driver get $500,000? Did you rob a shipment?" "It is legitimate money," I said, my hand not wavering. "I invested wisely. I lived below my means. I saved it for you." Terrence stopped laughing and his face hardened. He stepped closer to me, invading my personal space, looking down at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Put it away, Dad," he said, his voice cold and final. "Just put your pennies back in your pocket and buy yourself a new truck or maybe a retirement home. I do not need your scraps." "It is not scraps, Terrence. It is a future. I have a future," he snapped, gesturing grandly toward Byron, who was wiping his mouth with a silk handkerchief. "You want to talk about investment? Byron just pledged $2 million to my company. $2 million. Dad, that is real money. That is wealth. That is power. He is going to introduce me to venture capitalists in Dubai. He is going to open doors you do not even know exist." I looked at Byron, who was preening in the chair, puffing out his chest like a peacock. $2 million from a man who could not pay for his own dinner last night, a man who was wearing a stolen watch. It was a lie, a fantasy built on smoke and mirrors. "He is lying to you, son," I said quietly. "He does not have $2 million. He does not have $2,000. "Don't you dare!" Terrence shouted, his face turning red. "Do not. You dare stand there in your cheap suit and insult a man who has done more for me in 3 months than you did in 30 years I raised you, Terrence," I said, feeling a cold numbness spreading through my chest. "I fed you. I clothed you. I taught you how to ride a bike. You taught me how to be mediocre." Terrence spat the words, hitting me like physical blows. "Byron taught me how to dream. He taught me that I deserve more. He is a good man. Dad, a wealthy man, a powerful man. Not like you. You are just a worker. You are just the help." The silence that followed was absolute. I looked at my son, really looked at him. I saw the greed in his eyes, the arrogance in his stance, the weakness in his chin. He was not a victim. He was a volunteer. He had chosen the illusion over the reality. He had chosen the lie over the truth. I slowly lowered my hand and placed the envelope back into my inside pocket. The weight of it against my chest felt different now. It was no longer a gift. It was a burden. Removed. "I understand," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. "I hope his $2 million brings you the happiness you are looking for." "It will," Terrence said, turning his back on me to return to Byron. "Ty, believe me, it will now if you are done playing the benevolent father. I have to get ready." I stood there for a moment, watching him serve the man who was leading him off a cliff. I felt a strange sensation. It was the severing of a tie, the snapping of a cord that had bound me to him for 32 years. It was painful, but it was also liberating. I turned to leave my hand on the doorknob when the door flew open, nearly hitting me in the face. Courtney swept into the room like a hurricane of white lace and floral perfume. She was holding a clipboard and wearing a headset, barking orders at someone on the other end. "No," I said. "The hydrangeas go on the left, not the right." "The left. Are you?" Incompetent? Fix it now. She hung up and looked at me, her eyes narrowing. She did not see a father-in-law. She saw a stain on her perfect picture. What are you? What? Doing in here? She shrieked, looking from me to Terrence and back again. Lucius, you are ruining the aesthetic I was just leaving, I said, stepping aside. You are wrinkling him, she accused, pointing a manicured finger at Terrence's jacket. You are probably getting dust or grease or whatever it is you have on you all over his tuxedo. Get away from him. I have not touched him, I said calmly. Well, you are breathing his air, she snapped. She looked me up and down, her lip curling in disgust. And look at you. I told you to stay out of sight until the ceremony began. The photographer is taking candid shots in the hallway. I do not want you in the background ruining the composition. I will go to my seat, I said, moving toward the door. Not that way, she shouted, blocking my path with her body, her large white dress taking up most of the space. The guests are arriving through the main hall. My father, yes, business partners are out there. The senator is out there. I do not want them seeing you wandering around looking like you are lost. Go out the back. She pointed to a small, nondescript door in the corner of the room, a door meant for catering staff and cleaning crews. The service entrance, I asked, looking at the door and then back at her. Yes, the service entrance, she hissed. It leads to the garden. You can walk around the perimeter to the back of the seating area. Just stay out of sight until you sit down. And for God's sake, do not talk to anyone important. Just sit at table 19 and wait for the food. I looked at Terrence, expecting him to say something to defend his father, to tell his wife that I was not a servant to be shooed out the back door. But Terrence did not look at me. He was looking at himself in the mirror, adjusting his cufflinks, pretending I did not exist. I looked at Byron, who was smirking behind his glass, enjoying the show. Very well, I said, my voice ice cold. I will use the service entrance. I walked to the small door, my head held high. I did not look back. I did not say goodbye. I opened the door and stepped into a narrow concrete corridor that smelled of garbage and stale cooking oil. As the door clicked shut behind me, muffling the sounds of the luxury suite, I reached into my pocket and touched the envelope again. $500,000 they had thrown me out with the trash. Not knowing I was carrying a fortune in my pocket, I walked down the dark corridor, the sound of my footsteps echoing against the concrete blocks. They wanted me to be the help they wanted me to be, invisible. So be it. I would go out the back door, I would sit at the table near the kitchen, I would be the ghost at their feast. But as I pushed open the heavy metal door at the end of the hall and stepped out into the blinding sunlight, I knew one thing for certain. The man who walked into that room was a father trying to save his son. The man who walked out was a stranger who owed them nothing. I checked my phone. I had a text message from my assistant, Ms. Davis, telling me that the acquisition of the Venus mortgage was complete. I owned the building, I owned the land, I owned the very ground they were standing on. I smiled a cold, hard smile. They had sent me out the service entrance, but they did not realize that I now held the keys to the entire castle. Let the wedding begin. I thought walking toward the back of the garden let them have their moment. Because when the clock strikes midnight, the carriage is going to turn back into a pumpkin, and I am going to be the one smashing it. The garden ceremony was a masterclass in deception. Everything from the imported white orchids to the silk ribbons on the chairs screamed exclusivity, but to my trained eye, it all screamed rental. I sat in the back row a few feet away from the catering tent where the smell of heating trays and sternum-burning fuel mingled with the scent of expensive perfume. Courtney had made sure I was hidden behind a large floral arrangement, a ghost at the feast of my own replacement. The organ music swelled a dramatic crescendo that signaled the arrival of the bride. Dolores walked down the aisle, and I had to admit she looked beautiful. She was wearing a dress that was far too young for her, a mermaid cut with a train that required 2 flower girls to carry, but her smile was radiant. It was the smile of a woman who believed she had finally won the lottery. Byron stood at the altar, puffing out his chest in that white suit, looking like a plantation owner from a bad movie. He watched her approach with a look of possessive hunger, not love-greed. He saw her not as a partner, but as an asset, a trophy to polish his fraudulent reputation. When the music faded and the officiant began the service, the air grew heavy with humidity and expectation. I watched my son Terrence standing beside Byron, holding the rings, looking at this con man with a reverence he had never shown me. It broke my heart. but it also hardened my resolve. Then came the vows. Byron took a microphone, his voice booming across the lawn, ensuring that even the neighbors 3 streets over could hear his proclamation of love. "Dolores, my queen," he said, gazing into her eyes with practiced intensity. "I stand here today, not just to marry you, but to save you. I promise to give you the life you always deserved, but were denied. I promise to wipe away the stain of mediocrity that has colored your past." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He was not just praising her, he was erasing me. "I promise." He continued, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper to compensate for the wasted years. "The years you spent counting pennies, the years you spent living in the shadow of a man who could not give you the sun. I promise to show you what a real provider looks like, what true wealth feels like, what it means to be with a man who has ambition." The insult was precise and calculated. It was a slap in the face delivered from the safety of the altar. Slowly, heads began to turn. People shifted in their seats, craning their necks to look toward the back, toward the service entrance, toward me. I saw pity in some eyes, amusement in others. Courtney looked back at me, a smug smile playing on her lips. She was enjoying this. She was enjoying seeing the truck driver put in his place. I sat frozen, my face a mask of stone inside. I was burning the sheer audacity of this man to stand there in a rented suit wearing a stolen watch and lecture me on provision and ambition was almost impressive. In its delusion, he was building a monument to his own ego on a foundation of sand. I did not look away. I met their gazes one by one until they turned back around, uncomfortable with my stoicism. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I would not storm out. I would not cause a scene. I would sit there and let him dig his grave deeper with every word. Byron finished his vows with a flourish, wiping a fake tear from his eye. Dolores was sobbing openly, overwhelmed by the performance. She took the microphone, her hands trembling. "Byron," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you are my savior. You are the knight who came late, but right on time. Thank you for rescuing me from a small life. Thank you for showing me the world." I looked away, unable to watch her humiliate herself any further. My gaze drifted to the perimeter of the garden, scanning the crowd of guests. Most were strangers, friends of the Sinclairs or business associates. Byron was trying to impress, but near the entrance gate, standing in the shadow of a large oak tree, I saw a figure that did not belong. He was a large man wearing a black suit that fit him poorly, the fabric straining across his broad shoulders. He was not watching the ceremony. He was watching Byron. His arms were crossed over his chest, and he was tapping his foot with a restless, aggressive energy. I narrowed my eyes, focusing on his face. He had a scar running from his ear to his jaw, a souvenir of a life lived on the edge. I knew that face. It had been years, but you do not forget a face like that. It was a man known on the streets as Mad Dog Johnson. He was not a banker, he was not an investor, he was an enforcer, a debt collector for the kind of lenders who did not use credit scores or contracts. They used baseball bats and intimidation. I had seen him around the docks years ago when I was building my company. Collecting protection money from the smaller vendors, he was bad news, the kind of man you cross the street to avoid. Why was a mid-level enforcer for the city's loan shark standing at a high society wedding? Unless he was an invited guest, which seemed unlikely given his attire and demeanor. There was only one reason he was there. He was working. I watched as Mad Dog checked his watch, then looked back at Byron with an expression of pure menace. He was impatient, he was angry, and he was focused entirely on the groom. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a terrifying clarity. Byron was not just a con artist living on credit, he was in deep with the wrong people. You do not get a visit from Mad Dog Johnson for a late credit card payment. You get a visit from him when you owe a lot of money to dangerous people and you have stopped returning their calls. Byron was smiling at the altar, slipping a ring onto Dolores' finger, unaware that the Reaper was standing 20 yards away, checking the time. This was not just a wedding, it was a crime scene in the making. Byron was likely counting on Dolores' assets or the wedding gifts to pay off a debt that could get him killed. He was desperate, and desperate men do dangerous things. I looked at Terrence standing there oblivious, smiling like a fool. He had tied his wagon to a falling star and he had no idea he was about to crash. The ceremony ended with a kiss that was more performance than passion, and the couple walked back up the aisle to the sound of applause. Mad Dog stepped back into the shadows, disappearing behind the tree line. But I knew he had not left. He was waiting. The guests began to move toward the reception area, a large white tent set up on the other side of the lawn. I stood up stiffly, my knees protesting the long period of sitting motionless. I joined the flow of people, keeping my head down, maintaining my invisibility. The reception tent was even more over the top than the ceremony. Chandeliers hung from the canvas ceiling, and tables were laden with ice sculptures and seafood towers. It was a display of wealth, so aggressive it felt like an assault. I found my table 19, tucked away in a corner near the portable restrooms and the catering staging area. My dinner companions were exactly who Terrence had promised, the elderly nanny who had raised Byron. As first set of children, a landscaper who looked uncomfortable in his suit, and a few distant cousins who seemed confused as to why they were there. I sat down, my back to the wall, watching the room. Dolores and Byron were making the rounds, greeting guests, accepting congratulations. Dolores was beaming, thrusting her left hand out. "To anyone who would look," showing off her ring. "Look," she squealed to a group of women near the center of the room. 5 carats. "Byron designed it himself," he said. "Nothing else was good enough for me." The women gasped and cooed, leaning in to admire the stone. I watched from across the room, my vision sharpened by decades of inspecting goods for quality control. Even from this distance, something was wrong with the ring. A diamond of that size has a specific fire, a depth of light that draws the eye in. It plays with the spectrum, throwing flashes of gray and white with hints of color. This stone was throwing rainbows. It was flashing blue and orange and red with a chaotic brilliance that lacked depth. It was too clear, too perfect, too shiny. I stood up and walked toward the water station, moving closer to where Dolores was holding court. I needed to be sure. As I passed by, I glanced at the ring, catching the light from the chandeliers. It was unmistakable. The lack of inclusions, the high dispersion of light the way, the edges of the facets looked slightly rounded instead of razor sharp. It was cubic zirconia, a high-quality one perhaps, but a fake. Nonetheless, Byron had given my ex-wife a piece of glass and told her it was a king's ransom. I looked at Byron. He was laughing loudly, a glass of champagne in one hand, his other hand resting possessively on Dolores' waist. He caught my eye and winked a gesture of pure arrogance. He thought he had fooled everyone. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. I poured myself a glass of water, my hand steady, my mind racing. He had insulted me. He had stolen my watch. He had corrupted my son, and now he had married my wife with a Cracker Jack prize. I walked back to my table and sat down, the water tasting cool and clean against the bile rising in my throat. Dolores was showing off a lie, wearing a lie, living a lie. And the man in the black suit was waiting outside to collect the bill. I checked my phone, waiting for the message from my assistant that would give me the leverage I needed. The party was just getting started, and the guests had no idea that the floor was about to drop out from under them. I took a sip of water and waited, watching the light refract through the fake diamond on my ex-wife's finger. It was beautiful, it was flashy, and it was completely worthless, just like her new husband, just like the life she thought she had won. I settled in for the show, knowing that the final act was going to be a tragedy for them and a vindication for me. The truck driver was about to drive right through their house of cards. The reception was in full swing, a carnival of excess that made my teeth ache. Byron had commandeered the microphone again, unable to let a single moment pass without reminding everyone of his supposed magnificence. He stood in the center of the dance floor, the spotlight reflecting off his rented white suit and the fake gold chains around his neck. He looked like a televangelist selling salvation on a payment plan. Sat at table 19, nursing a glass of lukewarm water, watching the performance. My table mates had long since abandoned any attempt at conversation, mesmerized by the sheer volume of Byron's ego. Courtney was standing near the stage, beaming with a pride that was entirely unearned, while Terrence looked on with the adoration of a disciple. Byron raised a hand for silence, and the room obediently quieted down. "My friends," he boomed, his voice echoing through the tent, "today is just the beginning. Dolores and I are not just building a marriage, we are building an empire next month. We break ground on a project that will change the skyline of Dubai, a residential complex so luxurious it makes the Taj Mahal look like a gas station." The crowd gasped and applauded. Dolores clasped her hands to her chest. looking at him as if he had hung the moon. I stifled a laugh. Dubai, the man probably could not find Dubai on a map, let alone finance a construction project there, but the lie was so big, so audacious, that people swallowed it whole because they wanted to believe they wanted to be part of the magic trick. As Byron continued to drone on about marble floors and gold-plated faucets, I noticed a disturbance near the entrance of the tent. A tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a posture that commanded respect was walking in. He was not wearing a flashy suit or heavy jewelry. He wore a navy blue bespoke suit that whispered power rather than screaming it. It was Arthur Henderson. My breath caught in my throat. Arthur was the former president of the First National Bank of the city, a man of impeccable reputation and old money. He had retired 5 years ago, but his influence still ran deep in the community. He was the kind of man who did not need an invitation to be anywhere, but tonight, he was here as a guest of Courtney S. father, likely a favor between old golfing buddies. Byron did not notice him. He was too busy painting a picture of his imaginary wealth. But Arthur noticed Byron. I watched as Arthur paused mid-stride, his eyes narrowing behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He tilted his head to the side, listening to Byron S.'s speech. A look of confusion slowly morphing into recognition. Byron was shouting now, getting caught up in his own fantasy. And that is why I say, you have to grab life by the horns. You have to take what is yours, just like I took the market by storm, just like I built my fortune with my own 2 hands and a dream. Arthur stepped forward, moving out of the shadows and into the periphery of the spotlight. He was not trying to cause a scene. He was simply trying to get a better look, but his presence was magnetic. People naturally parted ways for him, creating a clear path to the stage. Byron finally saw him. He faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting to Arthur's face, then quickly away, but his ego was too inflated to stop. He saw an opportunity to validate himself in front of a member of the true elite. "And look who we have here," Byron announced, gesturing grandly toward Arthur. "Mr. Henderson, an honor, sir, truly, an honor to have a titan of industry at my wedding. Perhaps we can discuss some joint ventures later." Byron smiled that wide, predatory smile, expecting Arthur to nod politely or wave. But Arthur did not smile. He did not wave. He walked straight up to the edge of the dance floor, his gaze fixed on Byron like a laser beam. Byron's smile wavered slightly. "Mr. Henderson," Byron said again, a hint of nervousness creeping into his voice. "So glad you could make it." Arthur stopped 10 feet away from Byron. The microphone picked up the sound of Byron's nervous breathing. But Arthur did not need a microphone. His voice was trained in boardrooms and courtrooms. It carried with a clarity that cut through the humid air like a knife. "Byron." Arthur said, his tone not one of greeting, but of interrogation. "Byron Sinclair." "Yes," Byron said, puffing out his chest. "That is me." Arthur took a step closer, squinting as if he were looking at a specimen under a microscope. "I thought I recognize that voice," Arthur said loud enough for the first 5 rows to hear. "You are the man who worked the teller line at my downtown branch back in '99. The room went deadly silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. The murmurs died down. Even the catering staff froze. Byron laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. No, Mr. Henderson, you must be mistaken. I am a developer. I deal in real estate." Arthur shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving Byron's face. "I never forget a face," Arthur said, "and I certainly never forget a thief." A collective gasp went through the room. Dolores stood up, her hand flying to her mouth. Courtney looked like she had been slapped. "Excuse me," Byron said, his voice dropping, the fake bravado cracking. "I think you have had too much to drink, sir." Arthur ignored him, taking another step forward. The microphone was still in Byron's hand, broadcasting every second of his humiliation. "You were the one we caught diverting funds from the dormant accounts of deceased clients." Arthur continued, his voice steady and factual. "You targeted widows, elderly women who had no one to check their statements. You were skimming pennies at first, then dollars." "That is a lie," Byron shouted, backing away, sweat beading on his forehead. "Security. Get this man out of here. He is senile." Arthur did not flinch. He stood his ground, a pillar of truth in a temple of lies. "You went to prison," Arthur said calmly. "Federal prison for wire fraud and identity theft. 5 years, if I recall correctly. When did you get out?" Byron, was it last year or are you out on parole? The word parole hung in the air, a toxic cloud that suffocated the celebration. Byron looked around the room, his eyes wild, seeking an escape, seeking an ally, seeking anyone who would believe him over the most respected banker in the state. "This is outrageous," Byron sputtered, looking at Dolores. "Baby, tell him who I am." Dolores looked at Byron, then at Arthur, then back at Byron. Panic rising in her eyes, she was realizing that her golden goose might just be a cooked turkey. Arthur turned his back on Byron, dismissing him as if he were nothing more than a nuisance. His gaze swept across the room, scanning the faces of the shocked guests, until it landed on the back corner near the kitchen. It landed on me. I felt a jolt of electricity run through my spine. Arthur and I had done business together for 30 years. He had financed my first fleet of ships. He had advised me on my international expansion. He was one of the few people in this city who knew exactly who Lucius Freeman was. Our eyes locked. I gave a barely perceptible shake of my head, a silent command. "Do not blow my cover." "Not yet." Arthur understood he was a man of discretion, a man who knew how to play the long game. He paused, looking at me, sitting there in my vintage suit next to the portable toilets, and a look of profound confusion crossed his face. He did not understand why a billionaire was sitting with the help, but he respected me too much to question it. Publicly, instead of calling out my name, instead of revealing my empire. Arthur did something far more powerful. He bowed. It was not a casual nod or a wave, it was a deep formal bow from the waist. The kind of gesture a subject offers a king or a junior executive offers a chairman of the board. He held the bow for a full 3 seconds, a lifetime in social currency. Then he straightened up, nodded once with deep respect, and turned to walk away. The room exploded into chaos. Byron was screaming into the microphone, trying to regain control, trying to spin the narrative, trying to convince everyone that Arthur was a confused old man with dementia. "He is crazy," Byron yelled, his voice cracking. "He thinks I am someone else. He is confusing me with some low-level criminal. Look at me. Do I look like a bank teller?" But nobody was looking at Byron anymore. Every eye in the room had followed Arthur's bow. Every head had turned to see who the recipient of such a profound gesture of respect was. They were looking at me. Courtney was staring at me, her mouth agape, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. She looked from Arthur's retreating back to me, trying to connect the dots, trying to understand why the most powerful banker in the city would bow to her father-in-law. The truck driver, Terrence, looked like he was having a stroke. He was pale, sweating, shaking his head as if trying to clear a hallucination. I sat there calm and impassive, sipping my water. I did not acknowledge the bow. I did not smile. I just let the mystery hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. Dolores was looking at me too. A flicker of something dangerous in her eyes. Suspicion, calculation, fear. She knew me. She knew I had secrets, but she had always assumed those secrets were shameful. She had never considered that my secrets might be powerful. Byron saw the shift in attention. He saw that he was losing the room. He saw that the spotlight had moved. "Who are you looking at?" he demanded, following their gaze until he saw me sitting in the shadows. He snarled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You put him up to this, didn't you? You hired that old fool to come here and slander me. You are jealous because I have everything you never could give her." I slowly placed my glass on the table, the sound magnified by the sudden hush of the room. I stood up, my movements deliberate and slow. I adjusted my cuffs. I smoothed my jacket. I did not say a word to Byron. I did not defend myself. I did not attack him. I simply looked at him with the cold, detached gaze of a man watching an insect struggle in a spider web. Byron's face turned purple with rage. "Get him out of here," he screamed at the security guards. "Get that man out of here now." But the guards hesitated. They looked at Byron, sweating and manic, and then they looked at me, standing calm and composed, and they looked at the door where Arthur Henderson had just exited, and they did not move. They sensed the shift in power. They smelled the fear on Byron, and the authority on me. Byron threw. Byron. The microphone to the ground, the feedback screeching through the speakers, making everyone cover their ears. "This wedding is over," he yelled, grabbing a bottle of champagne from a passing waiter's tray and taking a swig straight from the bottle, "until you people learn some respect." He stormed off the dance floor, heading toward the bar, leaving his bride standing alone in the center of the room, looking like a statue of abandoned hope. The guests began to whisper a low hum of gossip and speculation that sounded like a swarm of bees. I sat back down, crossing my legs. I checked my watch. It was almost time for the next act. Courtney marched over to my table, her heels clicking aggressively on the wooden floor of the tent. She leaned over, getting right in my face, her breath smelling of nervous wine. "What did you do?" she hissed. "What did you say to Mr. Henderson? Why did he look at you like that?" I looked up at her, my expression bored. "I did nothing, Courtney. I said I haven't moved from this table all night as per your instructions." "Do not lie to me," she spat. "Mr. Henderson does not bow to truck drivers." "Who are you, Lucius? Who are you really?" "I am just the help, Courtney," I said, smiling a thin, cold smile, "just the man sitting by the kitchen door." She stared at me, searching my face for a crack for a sign, but I gave her nothing. She spun around and stormed off toward Terrence, grabbing his arm and whispering furiously in his ear. I watched them panic. I watched them crumble. I watched the doubt eat away at their certainty. Byron was at the bar, downing shots, trying to drown the truth that Arthur had just poured over him. But the truth is a buoyant thing. It always floats to the top. I looked toward the entrance of the tent. The flap was moving. Someone was coming in. Someone who had not been invited, but who had every right to be there. It was Mad Dog Johnson, the enforcer. He stepped into the tent, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Byron at the bar. He smiled a smile that promised violence and started walking. I checked my watch again, right on time. The climax was not over. It was just beginning. Arthur Henderson had lit the fuse, but Mad Dog was the explosion. I took another sip of water, watching the enforcer close the distance between himself and the groom. This was going to be a wedding reception they would talk about for years, and I had the best seat in the house. The air in the tent had changed, shifting from a celebratory atmosphere to one of suffocating tension after Arthur Henderson's departure. Courtney was the first to snap out of the trance, while the other guests murmured and cast side glances at my table. Courtney did not look at me. She looked at the head table, specifically at the velvet box sitting next to Dolores' champagne flute. Courtney was a shark in her own right. She was ambitious, shallow, and obsessed with status. She had married Terrence because she believed he was the heir to a comfortable future, but the cracks in the facade were starting to show, and survival instinct was kicking in. She needed to know the truth. She needed to know if she was standing on solid ground or if she was about to fall into a sinkhole. I watched as she maneuvered through the crowd, her movements sharp and jerky. She approached the head table where Dolores was busy trying to laugh off the incident with Mr. Henderson, talking too loudly about how old age affects the memory. Dolores was distracted, flustered, and completely unaware that her daughter-in-law was about to dissect her life. Courtney reached out and picked up the jewelry box, the one that had contained the diamond necklace Byron had presented to Dolores earlier in the evening, a gift that was supposed to seal the deal of their eternal love. Dolores had put the necklace on, but she had left the box sitting there open like a trophy. I leaned forward in my chair, my eyes fixed on Courtney's hands. She turned the box over, examining the quality of the velvet, running her finger along the hinge. She was looking for a brand name, a stamp of authenticity, something that said Cartier or Tiffany or Harry Winston. She frowned. There was no brand name. It was a generic cheap box, the kind you get at a mall kiosk. But then her fingernail caught on something on the bottom of the box, a small white sticker that had been hastily peeled off, but not completely removed. She brought the box closer to her face, squinting in the dim light of the chandeliers. She used her manicured nail to scratch at the sticker, peeling back the residue to reveal the text underneath. I could not see the words from where I sat, but I saw the blood drain from Courtney's face. Her eyes went wide and her mouth opened in a silent gasp. She looked at the box, then she looked at Dolores, then she looked at Byron with a mixture of horror and pure, unadulterated rage. The sticker did not say 14. Carat gold. It did not say made in Italy. It said property of stage right. Prop rentals. 24-hour rental. Late fees apply. Courtney stood there frozen, holding the evidence of her mother-in-law's fraud in her hand. The diamond necklace around Dolores' neck was not a family heirloom. It was not an investment. It was a prop glass and paste meant to sparkle under stage lights for a few hours before being returned to a warehouse. I saw the realization wash over Courtney. She had just watched her father-in-law, the supposed truck driver, receive a bow from a banking titan, and now she was holding proof that her new stepfather-in-law was renting his affection by the hour. The world she thought she knew was flipping upside down, and she was terrified. She dropped the box back onto the table as if it were radioactive. She did not say a word to Dolores. Not yet. She backed away, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit, looking for answers, looking for someone to blame. But the drama at the head table was just the prelude to the main event while Courtney was having her silent breakdown. The man in the ill-fitting black suit, Mad Dog Johnson, decided he had waited long enough. He stepped out of the shadows near the bar and began to cut a path through the crowd. He moved with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a freight train. Guests scrambled to get out of his way, sensing the violence radiating off him like heat waves. Byron was at the edge of the dance floor trying to charm a group of skeptical investors, laughing too loud, sweating too much. He did not see Mad Dog coming until it was too late. The enforcer walked right up to the groom and clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. It was not a friendly tap, it was a grip meant to paralyze. Byron flinched, dropping his champagne glass. It shattered on the dance floor, the sound sharp and jarring. Byron spun around, a smile plastered on his face, ready to greet another well-wisher. But the smile died instantly when he saw who was standing there. Mad Dog did not smile. He leaned in close, his face inches from Byron's, ignoring the personal space, ignoring the social norms of a wedding reception. "We need to talk, Mad Dog," said his voice, a low rumble that vibrated in my chest from 20 feet away. Byron's eyes darted around the room, seeking an escape, seeking security, seeking anyone who could save him. "Not now," he hissed, his voice trembling slightly. "This is my wedding, can't you see? I am busy." Mad Dog did not blink. He tightened his grip on Byron's shoulder, his knuckles turning white against the cheap fabric of the white suit. "I do not care if it is your coronation," Mad Dog said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "You have been dodging my calls. Byron, you have been dodging the boss that ends tonight right now." Byron looked like he was going to vomit. He looked at Dolores, who was still oblivious at the head table. Then he looked at the guests, who were starting to stare again. Okay. Byron stammered, forcing a laugh that sounded like a choke. "Just hold on, let's step outside, get some fresh air, old friend." He tried to shrug off Mad Dog's hand, but the enforcer did not let go. He steered Byron toward the side exit, the one that led to the service corridor, not the main entrance. Mad Dog was taking him out like the trash. I stood up immediately, my water glass left abandoned on the table. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment the facade would crumble completely. I moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, blending in with the catering staff clearing tables. I followed them to the side door, slipping through just before it swung shut. They were in the hallway, a narrow passage lined with marble pillars and decorative plants meant to hide the service elevators from the guests. It was quiet here, the music from the reception muffled by the heavy doors. I pressed myself behind a large pillar, holding my breath, listening. Byron was backed up against the wall, Mad Dog standing over him, imposing and terrifying. 200,000. Mad Dog growled, poking Byron in the chest with a thick finger. "That is the number, Byron, 200,000 plus interest. You said you would have it last week. I have it. I have it," Byron pleaded, his hands raised in surrender. "I just need a few more days. The wedding. Look at this wedding. It cost a fortune." "It cost a fortune. You do not have." Mad Dog snapped. "Did you pay for this, or did you put it on another line of credit?" "You do not have." "It is an investment," Byron insisted, sweating profusely. "Once this is over, once I have access to the accounts, I can pay you back double. I swear." "Access to what accounts?" Mad Dog asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Her accounts," Byron said, pointing toward the ballroom door. "My wife's accounts. She is loaded. Man, she was married to some guy for 30 years, got a massive settlement in the divorce. She has a house in the suburbs, fully paid off, worth at least 400,000. I checked the records. I smiled in the darkness, a cold predator's smile. So that was his plan. He had done his homework. He knew about the house. He knew about the divorce settlement, but he had missed one. Crucial detail, a detail that was about to cost him everything. "You are going to sell your wife's house?" Mad Dog asked, raising an eyebrow. "I am going to sell everything," Byron said, his voice gaining a desperate confidence. "That old hag will sign whatever I put in front of her. She is desperate. She thinks I am some big-shot developer. I will tell her we are leveraging the equity for a project in Dubai. She will sign the deed over to me by Monday morning, and I will have your cash by Tuesday noon." Old hag, the words hung in the air, heavy with contempt. He was not just a thief, he was a predator, feasting on Dolores' insecurity, exploiting her need for validation. He was going to strip her of the only asset she had left and leave her on the street without a second thought. Mad Dog laughed, a harsh barking sound. "I do not care how you get it. Byron, sell the house, sell the ring, sell the woman. I do not care, just get me my money, or the next time I see you I will be bringing a bone saw, not a conversation." "Need time," Byron begged. "Just give me until Tuesday." "You have until midnight," Mad Dog said, stepping back and adjusting his jacket. "Midnight tonight, or the boss comes down here himself and he won't be as polite as me." Mad Dog turned and walked down the hallway, heading for the exit. Byron sagged against the wall, wiping his face with a shaking hand. Muttering curses under his breath, he looked like a man who had just looked into the abyss and saw it staring back. I waited until Byron composed himself, until he put his mask back on and re-entered the ballroom. Then I stepped out from behind the pillar. I knew something Byron did not know. I knew who really owned that house. When Dolores and I divorced, I had been generous. I allowed her to stay in the family home, the house we had raised Terrence in, but I did not give her the deed. The house was held in a trust controlled by me. She had the right to live there for the rest of her life, as long as she did not remarry. The moment she said "I do" to Byron Sinclair, she violated the terms of the trust. The house was not hers to sell. It was not hers to leverage. It was not even hers to live in anymore. Legally, she was trespassing. Byron was planning to pay his gambling debts by selling a property that belonged to me. I walked back toward the ballroom, a sense of grim satisfaction settling in my gut. The trap was sprung, the jaws were closing, and they did not even feel the metal teeth. Yet Byron was going back in there to play the role of the loving husband, while plotting to sell his wife out to save his own skin. He was going to smile at her, kiss her, and then try to convince her to sign away her home. I checked my watch. 10 minutes until the police arrived, 10 minutes until the final curtain. I walked back into the reception. The music was loud, the people were dancing, and Courtney was sitting at the table staring at the jewelry box like it was a skull. I walked past her, ignoring her gaze, and took my seat at table 19. The waiter came by to refill my water glass. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" he asked, looking at me with a newfound respect, likely having seen the bull from Arthur Henderson. "Yes," I said, watching Byron grab Dolores' hand and lead her to the dance floor. "Bring me the check for the entire wedding." The waiter blinked, confused. "Sir," the groom said he was paying. "The groom is broke," I said calmly. "Bring me the bill. I want to see exactly how much his freedom costs." The waiter nodded nervously and hurried away. I sat back and crossed my legs, watching the happy couple sway to the music. Byron whispered something in Dolores' ear, probably a lie about how much he loved her, probably the first step in his plan to get her to sign the papers. She smiled up at him, that fake diamond flashing under the lights, oblivious to the fact that she was dancing with a wolf. But the wolf had forgotten one thing. The shepherd was back in town and he was done tending the flock. It was time to slaughter the predator. The waltz ended and Byron released Dolores, pulling her in for a final kiss that looked more like he was checking her teeth for gold fillings. He whispered something in her ear and then headed toward the bar. His shoulders slumped under the weight of his mounting panic. Dolores was glowing, unaware that her world was currently held together by duct tape and lies. She scanned the room, soaking up the attention until her eyes landed on me sitting quietly at table 19. Her smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated fury. She picked up her skirts and marched across the dance floor, her heels clicking like gunshots on the hardwood. I did not move. I did not flinch. I just watched her come, a heat-seeking missile in white lace. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into the fabric of my vintage suit. "You!" she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "Come with me now." She dragged me toward a secluded alcove near the dessert station, away from the prying eyes of the guests, but close enough that I could still see Byron downing another drink. "What is the meaning of this, Lucius?" she demanded, her face inches from mine, her breath smelling of champagne and malice. I gently removed her hand from my arm, smoothing the fabric where her nails had left indentations. "Meaning of what, Dolores?" I asked calmly. "Do not play dumb with me," she snapped, her eyes blazing. "You hired that man, didn't you, that Henderson fellow? You paid him to come here and humiliate Byron in front of everyone." I laughed a dry, humorless sound. "Dolores Arthur Henderson is not a man who can be hired. He is a man who owns half the city." "Liar," she spat. "You have always been jealous of Byron. You are jealous because he is everything you are not. He is successful, he is wealthy, he is powerful, and you are just a truck driver who got lucky enough to marry me for 30 years. The revisionist history was breathtaking. For 30 years, I had been the rock, the provider, the steady hand, while she had been the kite, always pulling against the string, always wanting to fly higher into storms she was not equipped to weather. I am not jealous, Dolores," I said quietly. "I am entertained." "Entertained," she shrieked, her voice rising, causing a few nearby guests to turn their heads. "You think this is funny? You think ruining my happiness is a joke? I have waited my whole life for a man like Byron, a man who can give me the things I deserve." "And what do you deserve?" "Dolores," I asked, truly curious. "I deserve the world," she said, throwing her arms wide, the fake diamond on her finger catching the light. "I deserve luxury. I deserve travel. I deserve to be treated like a queen, not like the wife of a blue-collar worker who comes home smelling of grease. I wasted my youth on you, Lucius," she continued, her voice trembling with self-pity. "I spent the best years of my life clipping coupons and waiting for sales while you were out there driving those damn trucks, never aspiring to anything more, never trying to better yourself for me." I listened to her rewrite our life together, erasing the nights I stayed up late helping Terrence with his homework, erasing the vacations I paid for by working double shifts, erasing the home I bought and maintained with my own 2 hands. "Byron is my reward," she declared, her eyes shining with tears of entitlement. "He is the universe paying me back for settling for you. He is going to take me to Dubai. He is going to buy me a villa in Italy. He is going to give me the life you never could." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the fear behind the bravado, the desperation behind the greed. She knew deep down that Byron was too good to be true, but she wanted the lie so badly she was willing to kill the truth to keep it. "You really believe that, Dawn, to you?" I asked softly. "I know it," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. "Byron has millions. He showed me his bank statements on his phone." "Screenshots, Dolores," I said, shaking my head. "Anyone can fake a screenshot." "You are just bitter," she sneered. "You cannot stand that I upgraded you. Cannot stand that I found someone better." I sighed, reaching into the inside pocket of my jacket. "I am not bitter, Dolores," I said, pulling out my phone, "and I am certainly not jealous. In fact, I feel sorry for you. Sorry for me," she laughed, a harsh grating sound. "Save your pity for yourself, Lucius. You are going to need it when you are alone in your little apartment, eating canned soup, while I am dining in Paris." I unlocked my phone and opened my banking app. Not the local credit union app she was used to seeing, but the secure app for my offshore accounts. The one that required a fingerprint and a facial scan to open. I tapped the screen, bringing up the current balance of my liquid assets, not the properties, not the stocks, just the cash, sitting in the account. Waiting for my next move, I turned the phone around and held it in front of her face. "Look," I said simply. Dolores squinted, focusing on the screen. She saw the bank logo, a prestigious Swiss institution. She saw my name, Lucius Freeman, clearly, displayed at the top, and then she saw the number. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly. She blinked, trying to process the digits, trying to count the commas. There were a lot of commas. "That is impossible," she whispered, reaching out to touch the screen as if to test if it was real. "It is very real." "Dolores," I said, pulling the phone back before she could smudge the glass. $25 million, she breathed, the number slipping out of her mouth like a prayer. "And that is just the checking account," I said, slipping the phone back into my pocket. "The portfolio is worth considerably more." She stared at me, her mind reeling, struggling to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the number she had just seen. But how she stammered. "You drove a truck." "I own the fleet, Dolores," I said, my voice hard. "I own the logistics company. I own the warehouses. I own the ships. I built it from the ground up while you were busy complaining about the size of our television." "You lied to me," she accused her, shock turning into anger. "You hid money from me. I protected it from you." I corrected. "I knew if you knew the extent of my wealth, you would spend it on things that do not matter. You would become exactly what you are now, a woman who measures her worth by the price tag on her dress." "You tricked me," she shouted, grabbing my lapels again. That is my money too. We were married for 30 years. Half of that is mine. Not anymore, I said, removing her hands firmly. The divorce is final. Dolores, you signed the settlement. You took the house and the alimony and you walked away. You wanted a quick divorce so you could marry Byron, remember? Her face crumbled, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. She had walked away from a fortune to marry a fraud. She had traded a diamond mine for a piece of glass. I did not know. She wavered, tears spilling down her cheeks. I did not know. Ignorance is expensive. Dolores, I said, adjusting my jacket. But Byron, she said, clutching at straws. Byron has money too. He is a developer. Byron is a thief, I said bluntly. He owes $200,000 to a loan shark who is currently standing outside waiting to break his legs. He rented this suit. He rented that necklace, and he rented you. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, that cannot be true. Ask him, I said, gesturing toward the bar where Byron was now arguing with the bartender. Ask him why Arthur Henderson called him a thief. Ask him why he needs to sell your house by Monday. My house, she gasped, he said. We were leveraging it for an investment. He is leveraging it to save his life, I said. And the funny thing is, Dolores, it is not even your house to sell. What do you mean? She asked, her eyes wide with terror. Check the deed, I said, turning to walk away. Check the trust. The house belongs to me. You are just a tenant, and tenants who violate the lease get evicted. I left her standing there in the alcove, her mouth open, her world collapsing around her. She looked at Byron, then she looked at me, then she looked at her. Fake diamond ring. The realization was dawning on her. She was not a queen, she was a mark, and the man she had discarded, the truck driver she had mocked, was the king she had been looking for all along. I walked back to my table, sitting down next to the portable toilets, feeling lighter than I had in years. The truth was out. The bomb had been dropped, and now all I had to do was watch the fallout. Dolores stood in the alcove for a long moment, swaying slightly. Then she straightened her spine, wiped her face, and turned toward the bar. She was walking toward Byron. But there was no love in her eyes anymore, only a cold, desperate fury. The predator was about to become the prey, and I had a front row seat. Byron intercepted Dolores halfway between the alcove and the bar. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with a desperation that bordered on violence. He saw her face pale and stricken. He saw the way she was looking at him like he was a stranger, like he was a monster, and his survival instinct kicked into overdrive. He did not know what I had shown her on my phone. He did not know about the $25 million. He only knew that his wife looked terrified, and he assumed she had found out about his debts. He assumed she knew he was a fraud. He assumed the game was up. Panic is a powerful drug. It makes men do irrational things. It makes them burn down the house to kill a spider. Byron looked over Dolores' shoulder and saw me sitting calmly at my table watching him. He saw the architect of his destruction, and he decided in that split second that if he was going down, he was going to take me with him. He did not ask Dolores what was wrong. He did not try to comfort her. He pushed past her, leaving her swaying on the dance floor, and lunged for the microphone stand that had been abandoned near the DJ booth. The feedback squealed again, a high-pitched shriek that silenced the murmuring crowd. Everyone turned to look at the groom, expecting a toast or perhaps an apology for his earlier outburst. Instead, they got a performance worthy of an asylum. Byron stood center stage, his chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face, melting his spray tan into orange streaks on his collar. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, his eyes wide and manic. "Security," he screamed, his voice cracking under the strain. "Get in here now!" The two rent-a-cops who had been hovering by the entrance looked at each other, confused, then slowly started walking toward the dance floor. "Get him out!" Byron yelled, pointing at me again, accusingly. "That man right there, Lucius Freeman. He is dangerous. He is threatening my wife." A collective gasp went through the tent, heads turned, swiveling between the frantic groom and the calm ex-husband sitting by the portable toilets. I did not move. I did not stand up. I simply folded my arms and watched him unravel. He cornered her. Byron continued fabricating a reality as he went along, trying to build a wall of lies to hide behind. He dragged her into the dark. He demanded money. He said if we did not pay him $50,000, he would ruin this wedding. He is trying to extort us. The lie was so bold, so outrageous, that for a moment it hung in the air, unchallenged. People love a scandal, and the idea of the bitter ex-husband trying to shake down the wealthy newlyweds was a juicy narrative. It fit the story Byron had been telling all night, the story of his success and my failure. "He is jealous," Byron shouted, gaining momentum, feeding off the shock of the crowd. "He cannot stand that we are happy. He cannot stand that I can provide for her. Look at him sitting there in his rags trying to steal from us. He is a parasite." Dolores stood frozen in the middle of the room. She looked at Byron spewing lies, and then she looked at me, the man who had just shown her a bank account with more zeros than she could count. She was caught in the crossfire of her own bad decisions, paralyzed by the sudden collision of her fantasy world and the cold, hard truth I waited for. I waited. Her to speak. I waited for her to defend me, to tell them that I was the one who had paid for everything for 30 years, that I was the one who had just offered her a lifeline of truth. But she said nothing. She just stood there trembling, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. Cowardice, I realized, was her defining trait. Courtney, however, did not hesitate. She saw an opportunity to cement her loyalty to the winning side, or at least the side she still desperately hoped was winning. She grabbed Terrence's arm, her nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. "Do something!" she hissed loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Are you going to let him ruin this? Are you going to let him threaten your mother?" Terrence looked at me, his eyes clouded with conflict and shame. He looked at Byron, the man who had promised him millions, the man who represented the future he wanted. He looked at the crowd, the important people, the investors, the judges, the society climbers. He saw their judgment. He saw their expectation. He had to choose, and God help him, he chose the lie. Terrence pulled away from Courtney and marched toward my table, his fists clenched at his sides. He moved with a stiff, jerky rhythm, driven by a toxic mix of embarrassment and ambition. I watched my son approach. I saw the boy I had taught to ride a bike. I saw the teenager I had taught to drive. I saw the young man I had helped with his college applications, and I saw him disappear, replaced by this stranger in a tuxedo who was willing to sell his soul for a seat at the table. He stopped in front of me, blocking my view of the rest of the room. He was breathing hard, his face flushed. "Get out," Terrence said, his voice shaking. I looked up at him, my expression mild. "I am finishing my water, Terrence," I said. "Get out," he screamed, the veneer of civility shattering completely. "Get out before I have you thrown out. You are an embarrassment. Look at you sitting here trying to ruin the best day of my mother's life. I am not the one ruining it, son," I said softly. "Do not call me son." He spat, spittle flying from his lips. "Do not you dare call me son. You are nothing to me. You are a loser. Dad, a bitter, jealous loser. Byron is twice the man you are. He protects this family. He provides for this family. You just take." The words cut deep, slicing through the armor I had built around my heart. I had expected anger. I had expected resentment, but the sheer hatred in his voice was something new, something rotten. "You do not know what you are saying," I told him, trying one last time to reach him. "He is using you, Terrence. He is using all of you." "Liar," Terrence shouted. He grabbed the edge of my table and flipped it. Plates crashed to the floor, glasses shattered, water and silverware went flying. Guests screamed, scrambling back to avoid the debris. I sat there amidst the wreckage, unmoving. "Get up," Terrence yelled, stepping over the broken glass looming over me. "Get up and get out." I stood up slowly, brushing a shard of glass from my sleeve. "I am leaving," I said, my voice cold, devoid of any warmth, any fatherly affection. "I am leaving Terrence. But before I go, I want you to remember this moment. Remember that you chose this. I do not care what I chose as long as it is not you," he sneered. He reached out and shoved me. It was not a playful push. It was a shove meant to hurt, meant to humiliate. He put both hands on my chest and pushed with all his strength. I stumbled back, my heel catching on a chair leg, and I went down. I landed hard on the wooden floor, my hip taking the brunt of the impact. A jolt of pain shot up my spine, stealing my breath. The room went silent, absolute, terrified silence. I lay there on the floor, looking up at the ceiling of the tent, looking at the chandeliers that were probably rented, looking at the silk ribbons that were hiding rusty metal poles. I looked at my son standing over me, his chest heaving, his hands still raised in the follow-through of his violence. He had struck his father. He had physically assaulted the man who gave him life in front of 200 people to protect a con man. He had known for 3 months. I saw the realization hit him. I saw the horror dawn in his eyes as he looked at his own hands, as if they belonged to someone else. He took a step back, his face draining of color. "Dad," he whispered the word, slipping out involuntarily. But it was too late. I pushed myself up, ignoring the pain in my hip, ignoring the gasps of the crowd. I stood up straight, adjusting my suit, dusting off my pants. I looked at Terrence, and I did not see my son anymore. I saw a man who had made a transaction. He had traded his integrity for a promise of gold, and now the bill was due. "You are dead to me," I said, my voice low and steady so that only he could hear it. "You are a stranger." Terrence flinched as if I had hit him. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he bit his lip and looked away, refusing to back down, refusing to apologize. Byron was back on the microphone, sensing that the tide had turned in his favor, sensing that violence had solved his problem. "That is right," Byron crowed triumphant. "Throw him out, Terrence. Show him who the man of the house is." Courtney was clapping slowly, joined by a few of Byron-esque cronies. A slow, rhythmic applause that sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I looked around the room one last time, memorizing the faces. The faces of the people who cheered for a father beating the faces of the people who looked away, the faces of the people who enjoyed the show. I fixed my gaze on Dolores. She was still standing in the middle of the room, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. She looked at me, then she looked at Terrence, then she looked at Byron. She knew. She knew everything. Now she knew I was rich. She knew Byron was a fraud. She knew her son was violent. She knew she had destroyed her family for a mirage, but she did nothing. She did not move. She did not speak. She just stood there, trapped in the prison of her own making. I turned my back on them. I turned my back on the son, who had pushed me, on the wife who had betrayed me, on the life I had tried to save. I started to walk toward the exit, my limp, slight but noticeable dignity, my only shield. "Stop right there," a voice boomed from the entrance. It was not Byron. It was not Terrence. It was the police. 4 officers in uniform marched into the tent, their hands resting on their holsters, their faces grim behind them. Walked a man in a trench coat holding a stack of papers. The music cut out completely. The applause died. Byron froze on stage, his mouth open mid-gloat. Terrence backed away from me, looking for a place to hide. Courtney dropped her clutch. The officer in the lead scanned the room. "We are looking for Byron." "Sinclair," he announced, his voice authoritative and bored. Byron dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a dull thud, rolling away. "That is him," I said, pointing a finger at the man in the white suit without turning around. "That is the man you want." The officers moved past me, ignoring the truck driver. Ignoring the family drama, focusing on their target, I stopped walking. I stood near the exit, watching Byron try to run. He actually tried to run. He jumped off the stage, scrambling toward the back flap of the tent, looking for an escape route. But Mad Dog Johnson was waiting there, leaning against the support pole, picking his teeth with a matchstick. He simply stepped into Byron's path, blocking him like a brick wall. Byron bounced off the enforcer and stumbled back right into the arms of the police. I watched as they cuffed him. I watched as he screamed for Dolores to help him. I watched as he begged Terrence to call his lawyer. I watched as my son realized that the man he had just assaulted his father for was being dragged away in handcuffs. And then I walked out into the night, leaving them to the darkness they had created. The sirens wailed outside, cutting through the stunned silence of the tent like a knife through canvas. Blue and red lights flashed rhythmically against the white fabric, creating a disorienting strobe effect that made the scene feel even more like a nightmare. Terrence looked at the entrance, and a smile of pure vindication spread across his face. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket and pointed an accusing finger at me. Finally, he shouted over the noise of the approaching sirens. "They are here for you, Dad. You are going to jail for disturbing the peace and assaulting the groom." He truly believed it. He was so blinded by his own narrative that he thought the police were his personal security force coming to remove the inconvenient old man who had ruined his mother's big day. He looked at me with a triumph that was almost pitying, confident that he had won. "Officer, over here," Terrence yelled, waving his arms as the 4 uniformed men marched onto the dance floor. He stepped aside, expecting them to make a beeline for where I stood near the exit, expecting the click of handcuffs on my wrists. But the officers did not even look at me. They moved with the precision of a tactical team. Their eyes locked on a single target. They marched past, Terrence ignoring his frantic gestures. They marched past Courtney, who was clutching her purse like a shield. They marched straight up to the stage where Byron was still frozen, his hands half raised in a gesture of surrender that came too late. Byron Sinclair, the lead officer, barked, his voice booming, without the need for a microphone. "Put your hands behind your back." Byron stumbled backward, tripping over the train of Dolores' dress. He looked at the officers, then at Mad Dog Johnson, who was still blocking the rear exit. Mad Dog did not run. He simply held out his wrists with a bored expression. He knew the game. He knew when it was over. He let the second officer cuff him without a struggle, a professional to the end. Byron, however, was not a professional. He was a coward. He tried to dodge to the left, but the third officer tackled him, slamming him against the DJ booth. The sound of equipment crashing to the floor mixed with Byron's high-pitched scream of terror. Terrence stood there, his arm still pointing at me, his mouth hanging open. He looked from the police wrestling his hero to the ground, back to me, standing untouched and calm. The cognitive dissonance was almost visible on his face. He could not process what he was seeing. The script had flipped and he was left reading the wrong lines. They cuffed Byron, dragging him to his feet. His white suit was stained with dirt and sweat. His toupee was askew, revealing the bald spot he tried so hard to hide. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. The lead officer, a man with a face carved from granite, pulled a folded paper from his pocket and began to read the charges. His voice was flat, emotionless, a stark contrast to the hysteria erupting around him. Byron Sinclair, also known as Barry Smith, also known as Robert Stone, you are under arrest, pursuant to a federal warrant issued by the District of New York. Federal warrant, the words rippled through the crowd. Guests gasped, clutching their pearls and their wallets, realized they had been partying with a fugitive. The officer continued reading the list of crimes, and it was long: wire fraud, interstate romance scams, money laundering, grand larceny, forgery of financial instruments, and identity theft. Romance scams. Courtney whispered, her voice carrying. In the sudden silence, she looked at Dolores, who was standing alone on the dance floor, her hands covering her mouth. Byron struggled against the cuffs, his eyes wild with panic. He looked at the officer, then at the crowd, desperate to find a lifeline, desperate to find someone to pay his bail, to buy his freedom. "This is a mistake," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "I am a businessman. I have assets. I have properties in Dubai. Tell them, Dolores, tell them who I am." Dolores did not move. She stared at him with wide, horrified eyes, seeing the man she married for the first time, not as a savior, but as a predator. Byron saw her hesitation, and his panic turned into aggression. He lunged toward her, restrained only by the officer's grip on his arm. "Dolores," he shouted, his voice raw, "pay them, give them the money. You are rich. Bail me out right now." The officer tightened his grip, yanking Byron back. "I need bail money," Byron yelled, thrashing like a trapped animal. "Dolores, write them a check. You have millions. You took half of that old man's assets when you divorced him. You told me you were loaded." The accusation hung in the air, stripping away the last layer of pretense. Byron was not just asking for help, he was revealing the entire foundation of their relationship. He had not married her for love. He had not married her for her beauty. He had married her because he thought she was his golden parachute. He thought she was the mark who would pay off his debts to Mad Dog Johnson and fund his escape. He thought she was rich because she had acted rich, because she had spent money she did not have, because she had bragged about a divorce settlement that existed only in her imagination. "Dolores, pay them," Byron screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Do not just stand there, you stupid woman. Get your checkbook. You are worth millions." Every eye in the room turned to Dolores. The spotlight from the DJ booth, which had been knocked askew during the scuffle, was now pointing directly at her, illuminating her tear-streaked face and the fake diamond necklace around her neck. She looked at Byron, the man who had promised her the world. She looked at Terrence, the son who had believed the lie. She looked at me, the ex-husband she had discarded for being too poor. She stepped backward, her heel catching on the hem of her dress. She grabbed the microphone stand to steady herself, her hand accidentally switching it back on. The speakers crackled to life, broadcasting her next words to the entire stunned assembly. "I do not have millions," she whispered, her voice trembling, amplified 1,000 times by the sound system. Byron stopped struggling. He stared at her, his chest heaving. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I do not have any money," Dolores sobbed, the truth finally pouring out of her like blood from a wound. "I have nothing. Lucius signed a prenuptial agreement 30 years ago. I did not get half the company. I did not get the stocks. I did not get anything. The crowd murmured, a wave of shock passing through the tent. Courtney put her hand to her forehead, looking like she might faint. But you said, Byron stammered, you said he was a truck driver. You said you managed the finances, you bought the cars, you bought the clothes. I put it on credit cards, Dolores cried, her composure shattering completely. I lived off the monthly allowance he gave me, $2,000 a month. That is all I have, $2,000, and a lease on a car I cannot afford. Byron's face went slack. His jaw dropped. He looked as if someone had just told him the earth was flat. He had spent 6 months courting this woman. He had spent thousands of borrowed dollars, renting suits and cars to impress her. He had risked his life with loan sharks all because he thought he was reeling in a whale. Instead, he had caught a minnow wrapped in tinfoil. $2,000 a month, Byron repeated, his voice hollow. You are broke, you are penniless. I thought you were rich, Dolores wailed, pointing a shaking finger at him. You said you were a developer, you said you had millions. I thought you were going to pay off my debts. I thought you were going to save me. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. It was the silence of two con artists realizing they had conned each other. Two parasites who had attached themselves to the same host, only to find out the host was already dead. Byron started to laugh. It was a low, guttural sound that built into a manic cackle. He laughed until tears streamed down his face. He laughed until he was gasping for air. I am broke, he wheezed, leaning against the officer for support. You are broke. We are both broke. He looked at Mad Dog Johnson, who was being led away by another officer, and even the enforcer looked disgusted. You married me for my money, Dolores screamed, her vanity wounded more than her heart. And you married me for mine, Byron shot back, his laughter dying, instantly replaced by a look of pure loathing. Look at us, the gold digger and the gigolo, a match made in hell. The officer yanked Byron's arm, tired of the soap opera. Let's go. Sinclair, you can discuss your marital finances in the holding cell. They dragged him away, his feet dragging on the floor, his white suit ruined his dignity. Gone. He looked back at Dolores one last time, his eyes full of hate. You are worthless, he spat. You are nothing. Dolores collapsed onto the floor, her dress billowing around her like a wilted flower. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The microphone stand fell with a clang, the final note in their symphony of destruction. I stood by the exit, watching the scene unfold. I felt no joy, only a deep, profound weariness I had. Tried to tell them I had tried to warn them, but they had been so blinded by the glare of Fool-esque gold that they could not see the cliff until they had already walked off the edge. Terrence stood alone in the middle of the room, looking from his weeping mother to the empty doorway where his hero had just been dragged out in handcuffs. He looked lost, a child who had woken up in a strange house with no lights. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, begging for me to fix it, begging for me to be the father who always made the bad things go away. But I was not that father anymore. That father had died the moment his son pushed him to the ground. I turned and walked out of the tent into the cool night air, leaving them to the ruins of their own ambition. The police cars were driving away, their lights fading into the distance. The show was over. The curtain had fallen, and the only thing left was the bill. The silence that followed the departure of the police was heavy and suffocating, a vacuum left by the sudden removal of all the oxygen in the room. Dolores sat weeping on the floor, a pile of white lace and broken dreams, while the guests stood frozen, uncertain if they should leave or stay to watch the final act of this tragedy. I remained by the service exit, my hand resting on the doorframe, ready to walk away and never look back. But fate, it seemed, was not quite finished with the Freeman family. The heavy double doors of the main entrance banged open, shattering the quiet. A man in a tuxedo ran into the room, his face slick with sweat, his eyes darting around with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. It was Mr. Ricci, the manager of the venue, the man responsible for the crystal chandeliers, the imported orchids, and the 5-course meal that was currently getting cold in the kitchen. "Where is he?" Mr. Ricci shouted, waving a credit card terminal in the air like a weapon. "Where is Mr. Sinclair?" The guests parted ways, allowing Richie to see the empty spot where the groom had been standing just moments. Before he looked at the floor where the microphone lay, he looked at Dolores, sobbing in her ruin. And then he looked at the police cars fading into the distance. He was arrested. Someone whispered from the back of the room. Arrested. Mr. Ricci's face drained of all color, leaving him looking like a wax figure melting in the heat. Arrested. But who is going to pay the bill? He marched toward the center of the room, his professional demeanor cracking under the weight of a six-figure loss. He stopped in front of Dolores, ignoring her distress, ignoring the fact that her life had just imploded. He was a businessman, and right now he was looking at a very bad investment, Mrs. Sinclair. He demanded, his voice rising to a near scream. The card on file was declined for the third time. The deposit was fraudulent. The check bounced this morning. My bank just called me. Dolores looked up at him, her mascara running down her cheeks in black rivers. She shook her head slowly, unable to speak, unable to comprehend that the hole she had dug was getting deeper. I do not care about your personal problems, Mr. Ricci yelled, the vein in his forehead bulging dangerously. This event costs $150,000. The food, the staff, the rental of the estate. Someone has to pay this bill right now, or I am calling the police back here and having every single person whose name is on the contract arrested for theft of services. The threat hung in the air. Terrified, and real theft of services was a felony. Especially at this amount. Prison was not just a possibility for Byron anymore, it was a looming reality for anyone who had signed on the dotted line. Mr. Ricci turned his gaze to the best man, the son of the bride, the man standing in a custom tuxedo that he probably had not paid for either. You, he said, pointing a trembling finger at Terrence, you are the son, right? You signed as a witness on the contract. Terrence took a step back, his hands raising in a pathetic gesture of defense. I do not have that kind of money, he stammered. I just signed as a witness. I did not agree to pay. You are a party to this fraud, Mr. Ricci snapped, pulling his phone from his pocket. I am dialing 911 right now. You can explain to the officers why you ate my food and drank my wine with no intention of paying for it. Panic, true, primal panic set in. Courtney grabbed Terrence's arm, her nails digging into the fabric of his jacket. She looked at the manager, then at Dolores, then at the exit, realizing there was no way out. She had married into a family of frauds, and now the bill collector was at the door. And then her eyes landed on me. I was still standing in the shadows by the service door, the truck driver, the embarrassment, the man they had tried to hide. She looked at me, and I saw the gears turning in her head. She remembered Arthur Henderson bowing. She remembered my confidence. She remembered that I was the only person in the room who was not panicking. She did not know the full truth yet, but she knew I was their only hope. She shoved Terrence hard, pushing him toward me. Ask him, she hissed. Ask your father. Terrence stumbled, looking at me with wide, fearful eyes. He shook his head, ashamed, terrified. But Courtney was relentless. She grabbed his hand and dragged him across the dance floor, pulling him toward the father he had assaulted just minutes before. They stopped 5 feet away from me, Courtney. His face underwent a miraculous transformation. The sneer vanished, replaced by a trembling lip and wide, pleading eyes. She looked like a different person, a victim, an innocent bystander caught in a storm. Dad, she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet syrup that made my stomach turn. Dad, please, you have to help us. I looked at her coldly, saying nothing. Mr. Ricci is going to call the police, she continued, tears welling up in her eyes, perfectly timed tears. They are going to arrest Terrence, Dad. They are going to arrest your son. He did not know, Dad. He is innocent. He was tricked, just like Dolores. Please, you cannot. Let him go to jail. It is his wedding day. Well, his mother's wedding day. It is supposed to be a happy occasion. She squeezed Terrence's hand, prompting him. Dad. Terrence whispered, his head bowed. I do not have the money. You have $2 million, I said. My voice flat. Byron gave it to you, remember? Terrence flinched as if I had slapped him. There is no $2 million, he choked out. It was all a lie. Please, Dad, if you have any savings, anything at all, we need help. Courtney stepped closer, invading my personal space, the smell of her expensive perfume cloying and suffocating. We know you have some money saved, she said, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. You offered him that envelope earlier, $500,000. You said that is more than enough to pay the bill. Dad, please be the hero. Be the bigger man. Save your family. The audacity was breathtaking. 10 minutes ago, I was a loser, a stain to be hidden. Now, I was the hero, the savior, the bigger man. They did not want me, they wanted my wallet. They wanted the truck driver's savings to clean up their mess. I looked at Mr. Ricci, who was tapping his foot impatiently, his thumb hovering over the call button on his phone. I looked at Dolores, who was watching us from the floor, a flicker of hope igniting in her eyes. She thought I would do it. She thought I would fold, just like I always had. I reached into my pocket and felt the envelope. The paper was warm against my fingers. $500,000. It was trash to me now. Useless paper. I stepped past Courtney, brushing her shoulder with my own, ignoring her gasp of surprise. I walked past Terrence, who reached out to grab my arm, but pulled back at the last second. I walked straight to the center of the room toward the stage where the microphone lay abandoned. Mr. Ricci followed me, confused but hopeful, thinking I was coming to pay. I picked up the microphone, feeling the weight of it in my hand. I looked out at the sea of faces, the guests who had laughed at me, the family who had scorned me, the strangers who had judged me. I adjusted my vintage suit, smoothing the charcoal wool. I stood up straight, my posture shifting from the slump of a tired worker to the commanding stance of a CEO. Arthur Henderson stepped out from the crowd he had been watching from the sidelines, waiting for my signal. He walked up the stairs to the stage and stood beside me, a silent sentinel of legitimacy. He took the microphone from my hand and turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur said, his voice booming with authority, filling the tent, silencing the murmurs, stopping Mr. Ricci in his tracks. "May I have your attention, please?" He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the anticipation build. "There has been a great deal of confusion tonight," Arthur continued. "Many lies have been told, many masks have been worn, but it is time for the truth." He turned and gestured to me with an open hand, a presentation of the highest order. "It is my distinct honor and privilege," Arthur said, his voice filled with genuine respect, "to introduce you to my oldest friend and business partner, a man who built an empire from a single truck, a man whose integrity is the gold standard in our industry." The room held its breath. Courtney's mouth fell open. Terrence took a step back, shaking his head in denial. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur roared, "allow me to present Mr. Lucius Freeman, the founder, chairman, and majority shareholder of Freeman Logistics, the owner of the largest commercial shipping fleet on the eastern seaboard, and one of the wealthiest men in this state." The reaction was visceral, a physical wave of shock that slammed into the audience. Gasps erupted like gunfire. Glasses dropped shattering on the floor. "Freeman Logistics," someone whispered loudly. "That is a billion-dollar company." Terrence's legs gave out. He did not faint. He simply crumbled, falling to his knees on the hardwood floor as if the weight of his mistake was too heavy to bear. Standing up, he looked up at me, his eyes wide and vacant, his brain unable to compute the data. Courtney let out a strangled sound, a whimper of pure horror. She looked at my suit, the suit she had mocked, and suddenly she saw the quality, she saw the cut, she saw the man inside it. She realized she had sent a billionaire to sit by the toilets. Dolores was staring at me from the floor, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. She was doing the math in her head. She was calculating 30 years of trucks, 30 years of grease, 30 years of believing she was poor when she was sleeping next to a king. I took the microphone back from Arthur and looked down at Mr. Ricci. The venue manager was trembling, the phone slipping from his fingers. He knew who Freeman Logistics was. Everyone in the supply chain knew. He realized he had just threatened to arrest a man who could buy his entire company with pocket change. "Mr. Ricci," I said, my voice calm, steady, resonant, the voice of the boardroom, not the break room. "Yes, sir," Mr. Ricci squeaked, sweating profusely. "You have a bill that needs to be paid," I stated. "Yes, sir. $150,000, sir. But please, if I had known." I held up a hand, silencing him. I looked at Terrence kneeling on the floor. I looked at Courtney shaking in her designer dress. I looked at Dolores broken and empty. They waited. They waited for me to pull out the checkbook. They waited for me to save them. They waited for the happy ending, where the benevolent patriarch forgives the wayward children and throws money at the problem. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the manila envelope, the one Terrence had rejected, the one that contained the seed money, the hope, the love. I held it up for everyone to see. "This envelope contains $500,000, I said, my voice echoing through the tent. It was a gift for my son, a start for his future. He told me it was scraps. He told me he did not need my pennies. I looked at Terrence. Tears were streaming down his face. Now real tears, tears of loss. You wanted a wealthy man. Terrence, I said, speaking directly to him, you wanted power, you wanted influence. Well, here it is. I ripped the envelope in half. The sound of the thick paper tearing was louder than a gunshot. Terrence screamed a sound of pure anguish. No, Dad, no. I tore it again and again, shredding the check, shredding the bank book, shredding the letter, shredding the last vestiges of my hope. I threw the pieces into the air like confetti. They fluttered down around Terrence, landing in his hair, on his shoulders, on the floor, around his knees. It is just paper, son, I said, my voice cold. It is just scraps. I turned to Mr. Ricci, who was watching with wide eyes. Mr. Ricci, I said, send the bill to the groom. He wanted to be the man of the house. Let him pay for the roof over his head. But, sir, Ricci stammered, he has no money. Then call the police, I said, turning my back on them. I believe theft of services is a felony. I walked toward the stairs, Arthur Henderson falling into step beside me. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, making way for the chairman, making way for the father who had finally had enough. Dad. Terrence wailed from the floor. Do not leave me. Please, do not leave me. I did not stop. I did not look back. I walked out of the tent, out of the garden, and into the night, leaving my son on his knees covered in the shredded remains of his inheritance, leaving my ex-wife in the ruins of her fantasy, leaving them to the consequences of their own choices. The air outside was cool and clean. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with freedom. It is done, Arthur said quietly as we reached the waiting town car. Yes, I said, getting into the back seat. It is done. The car pulled away and I watched the lights of the venue fade into the darkness. I was alone, but for the first time in a long time, I was not lonely. I was free. The silence in the tent was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered the earlier festivities, leaving only the raw, exposed nerves of a family destroying itself. Mr. Ricci, the venue manager, stood before me, his hand trembling as he held out the invoice. It was a single piece of paper representing $150,000, a sum that would bankrupt most people. But to me, it was less than the fuel cost for one of my container ships crossing the Atlantic. I looked at the paper, then I looked at Mr. Ricci. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. He knew who I was. Now, he knew I could pay this bill with the loose change in my pocket. He expected me to be the savior, to whip out a checkbook and make the problem go away, because that is what fathers do. They clean up the messes their children make. I reached out and took the invoice from his shaking hand. The paper felt crisp and light between my fingers. I glanced at the total, noticing the charges for premium champagne that had been sprayed on the floor and the imported flowers that were now wilting in the heat. Mr. Ricci watched me, holding his breath, waiting for the pen to appear, waiting for the signature that would save his job and his venue. I looked up from the paper and met his gaze, my eyes cold and unyielding. Mr. Ricci, I said, my voice calm and resonant, carrying to the back of the silent tent. This is a significant sum of money. Yes, sir. Mr. Ricci squeaked, wiping sweat from his forehead. It is, sir, but for a man of your stature, I cut him off with a raised hand. I could buy this venue. Mr. Ricci, I said, looking around at the silk drapes and the crystal chandeliers. I could buy this entire estate, write a check for the land and the building, and turn it into a parking lot for my trucks by tomorrow morning without even calling my accountant. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Courtney put a hand to her throat, her eyes wide. But I continued, my voice dropping an octave. This is not my party. I did not sign this contract. I did not choose the flowers. I did not invite these people, and I certainly did not order the champagne. I extended my hand and pressed the invoice back into Mr. Ricci's chest. He took it, reflexively looking confused and terrified. But sir, he stammered, the groom, he has no money, and your son? My son is an adult, I said, my voice hard as steel. He wanted to be the best man. He wanted to stand next to a wealthy man. Well, he got his wish. He stood next to Byron Sinclair, and he made his choice. Now he can pay the price. I pointed a finger at Terrence, who was still kneeling on the floor looking up at me with the eyes of a frightened child. Give the bill to the groom, I said, or give it to his best man. Let them work it out. I owe you nothing. Mr. Ricci looked at Terrence, then back at me. realizing finally that there would be no bailout. He stepped back, clutching the invoice to his chest like a shield, turning his angry gaze toward my son. Terrence let out a sob, a pathetic sound that echoed in the quiet tent. He crawled toward me, moving on his knees across the hardwood floor, ignoring the whispers of the guests, ignoring the ruin of his tuxedo. "Dad," he cried, reaching out to grab the hem of my pants, "please. You cannot do this. You cannot leave me here with this debt. They will arrest me, Dad. They will put me in jail." I looked down at him, feeling a strange detachment. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders. This was the boy I had taught to shave. This was the boy I had loved more than my own life. And now he was a stranger. A weak, grasping stranger who only knew how to take. I stepped back, moving my leg out of his reach. "You are not the victim here, Terrence," I said, my voice devoid of pity. "You are not a child who made a mistake. You are a grown man who made a calculation." "I was tricked," he wailed, tears streaming down his face. "Byron lied to me. Mom lied to me. I did not know." "You knew enough," I countered, my voice rising slightly. "You knew enough to be ashamed of me. You knew enough to ask me to sit by the kitchen. You knew enough to tell me I was a failure because I drove a truck." He froze, his mouth opening and closing, unable to deny the truth. "You did not care about my character, Terrence. You cared about my wallet, and when you thought my wallet was empty, you threw me away like garbage. Now that you know it is full, you are crawling on the floor. It is not love, son. It is greed." I reached into the inside pocket of my vintage suit, the suit Courtney had mocked, the suit that smelled of success and hard work. I pulled out the thick manila envelope, the one I had tried to give him in the dressing room, the one he had sneered at. "Do you remember this?" I asked, holding it up for the room to see. "Terrence S." Eyes locked onto the envelope, hope flickering in his gaze, a desperate, hungry hope. "Yes, Dad," he whispered, scrambling to his feet, wiping his eyes. "Yes, the seed money. You said it was seed money." I opened the envelope and pulled out the contents, a bank book from a trust account and a certified cashier, S check, made out to Terrence Freeman. I held the check up to the light so everyone could see the numbers. $500,000, I announced, my voice booming through the tent. $500,000. This was my gift to you, Terrence. This was the money I saved while you were sleeping, while you were playing video games, while you were complaining that we did not have a swimming pool. I saved this so you could build something of your own, so you could be a man. Terrence reached out his hands, trembling. "Dad, please," he begged. "I am sorry. I was wrong. I will change. I swear I will change. Just give me a chance." I looked at the check. Then I looked at my son. "You told me this was scraps." I said, "You told me to buy a new truck. You told me Byron was going to give you $2 million. He lied." Terrence screamed, his voice cracking. "He lied to me. But you believed him." I said, "Simply because you wanted the easy way out. You wanted the shortcut. You did not want to work, Terrence. You wanted to be given the world." I took the check in both hands. "No." Terrence gasped, realizing what I was about to do. "No. Dad, do not." I ripped the check in half. The sound was sharp and final, a tearing of paper that sounded like the breaking of a bone. Terrence screamed, a sound of pure anguish, falling back to his knees as if I had shot him. I put the two halves together and ripped them again and again, turning the fortune into confetti. I threw the pieces into the air and they fluttered down around him, landing in his hair, on his shoulders, on the floor around him, white snowflakes of lost opportunity. "It is just paper. Terrence," I said, looking down at him. "It is just scraps, remember?" The guests were silent, watching the destruction of a fortune with wide eyes. Courtney was sobbing quietly, her face buried in her hands. Dolores was staring at the floor, her spirit completely broken. I reached into the envelope again and pulled out the bank book, the record of 30 years of deposits, 30 years of love expressed in compound interest. "And this," I said, holding up the book, "this represents every shift I worked, every holiday. I missed every sacrifice I made for you." Terrence reached up, grabbing at the air, trying to stop me. "Dad, stop, please stop," he sobbed. I ripped the bank book, tearing the pages from the binding, shredding the history of my devotion. I dropped the mangled book on top of the shredded check, burying him in the debris of his inheritance. "There is your seed money, son," I said, my voice cold and final. "Plant it and see what grows. My guess is nothing but weeds. Terence was curled in a ball on the floor, weeping uncontrollably, broken by the weight of his own foolishness. He had bet everything on a lie and lost the only truth he ever had. I straightened my jacket, adjusting my cuffs, feeling an immense weight lift from my shoulders. I was done. I was free. The tether was cut. I looked at Mr. Ricci, who was watching the scene with a mixture of horror and awe. "Call the police!" "Mr. Ricci," I said, pointing at my son. "Call them now and have him arrested for theft of services. He signed the contract, he ate the food, he drank the wine, let him pay the price." "But, sir," Mr. Ricci whispered, "he is your son." Looked at Terence one last time, a huddled mass of regret and tuxedo fabric. "No," I said, turning my back on him. "I have no son. My son died the moment he pushed me to the ground to protect a con man. That man on the floor is a stranger." I walked toward the exit, Arthur Henderson stepping out of the crowd to join me. The guests parted like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of fear and respect. They knew they were witnessing something biblical, a judgment day in a wedding tent. As I reached the edge of the dance floor, I stopped and looked back at the head table where Dolores was sitting, her head in her hands, and then at the spot where Byron had been dragged away. "You wanted a wealthy man to guide you, Terence," I called out, my voice carrying over his sobs. "You wanted a rich father figure. Well, you picked Byron Sinclair. He is a thief and a liar, but he knows how to survive in a cell." I paused, letting the words sink in, letting the reality of his future settle over him like a shroud. "He is going to prison, son," I said, "and now you are going to join him. Let him teach you how to live in a cage. Let him teach you how to survive when you have nothing, because that is all you have left. Nothing." I turned and walked out of the tent, stepping into the cool night air, the sound of Terence wailing fading behind me. I did not look back. I did not hesitate. I walked toward the waiting town car where my driver was holding the door open. I got in, and the door closed with a solid, reassuring thunk, shutting out the noise, shutting out the drama, shutting out the past. "Drive," I said to the driver. "Where to, sir?" he asked. "The airport," I said, leaning back in the leather seat. "Take me back to the airport. I have a villa in Portugal and a glass of wine waiting for me." The car pulled away, leaving the chaos of the wedding behind, leaving the ruins of the Freeman family in the rearview mirror. I was alone, but I was whole. I had lost a son, but I had found myself, and that was a trade I was willing to make the Atlantic. Ocean stretched out before me, a vast sheet of blue silk shimmering under the Portuguese sun. I sat on the terrace of my villa in the Algarve, the air smelling of salt and grilled sardines, a stark contrast to the scent of desperation and cheap perfume I had left behind in America. It had been a month since the wedding, a month since I detonated the nuclear bomb that was my true identity and walked away from the blast zone without a backward glance. My life had returned to its natural rhythm. Mornings were spent reviewing logistics reports from my global fleet. Afternoons were for inspecting the local vineyards I had acquired, and evenings were for silence, blessed, uninterrupted silence. No demands for money, no veiled insults, no performances of poverty. Just the quiet satisfaction of a man who had built an empire and finally stopped apologizing for it. I took a sip of a 30-year-old tawny port, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, looking at the sun dipping toward the horizon I was at. Peace. I was free, or so I thought, until my phone buzzed on the marble table, shattering the tranquility. I glanced at the screen, expecting a call from my harbor master in Lisbon, or perhaps my attorney in New York instead. The name Courtney flashed on the display. I stared at it for a long moment, the phone vibrating against the stone like an angry insect. I had not heard from her since the night of the wedding, since I left them in the wreckage of the reception tent. I debated ignoring it. I had cut ties. I had walked away. I owed them nothing, but a dark curiosity stirred within me. The part of me that had watched them crumble wanted to know the extent of the damage. The part of me that had been humiliated for years wanted to hear the aftermath. I swiped answer and put the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I did not offer a greeting. I just listened. "Dad?" She choked out, her voice thin and trembling. "Please do not hang up. I just needed to hear your voice." I remained silent, staring at the horizon, letting her sweat. "Everything is gone." "Dad?" She continued, the words spilling out in a desperate rush. They came for Terrence 3 days ago. The police came to the apartment we were renting after the eviction. Not for the wedding bill, but for other debts. Gambling debts we did not know about. He owes $50,000 to a sports book in Jersey. He spent 2 nights in jail before I could scrape together the bail money from my parents' retirement fund. I took another sip of wine, feeling no pity. Only a cold detachment. Actions have consequences, Courtney, I said simply. It is worse than that, she sobbed. The firm fired him the moment the arrest went public. They cited a morality clause in his contract. He lost his license. He cannot work in finance anymore. He just sits in the dark now, staring at the wall. He does not speak. He does not eat. He is broken. Dad, he is completely broken. I swirled the port in my glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. Terrence had chosen the quick money over the hard work. He had chosen the illusion over the reality. Now reality had come to collect. And Dolores, I asked almost as an afterthought. She paused, letting out a shuddering breath that sounded like a death rattle. It is bad. Dad, it is really bad. Byron had her sign papers' power of attorney documents. She did not read because she trusted him, because she thought he was a tycoon. He leveraged everything she had against his own debts when the feds seized his assets. They took hers too. The house is gone. The bank foreclosed yesterday. She sniffed loudly, a pathetic sound. She is moving into a state-assisted housing project tomorrow, a studio apartment in the worst part of town, next to the industrial district. She has nothing left. The diamonds were fake. The life was fake. The only real thing was the debt. She cries all day, calling your name, asking why you did not save her. I felt a flicker of satisfaction, not malicious, but just justice. Dolores had spent 30 years looking down on the life I provided. She had called it small. She had called it mediocre. Now she would know what small really felt like. I waited, knowing there was more. Courtney was not calling just to give me a news report. She was a survivor, a climber, and climbers never stop looking for the next rung on the ladder, Dad, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, a tone she probably thought was seductive, but just sounded desperate. I cannot stay here. I cannot sink with them. I am young. I have my whole life ahead of me. I am going to file for divorce. I am leaving Terrence. I raised an eyebrow. So the rats were finally eating each other. I thought maybe I could come to Portugal, she rushed on, the words tumbling over each other. I could take care of you, Dad. You are all alone in that big house. You are getting older. You need someone to look after you, someone to manage your affairs, someone who is family. A laugh bubbled up in my throat, a deep, genuine sound of amusement that startled the birds in the garden. She wanted to trade one host for another. She had sucked Terrence dry, and now that he was a husk, she wanted to attach herself to me. She wanted to leverage the very relationship she had mocked to gain entry into the palace she had been too blind to see. You want to be my housekeeper? I asked, letting the absurdity of the suggestion hang in the air. You want to manage my affairs? Yes, she said eagerly, misinterpreting my tone. I would be so good to you, Dad. I would make sure you never have to lift a finger. I know how you like things. I know you. You know nothing about me, Courtney, I said, my voice turning hard as granite, the amusement vanishing instantly. You looked at me for 3 years and saw a truck driver. You looked at my hands and saw dirt, not capability. You looked at my life and saw failure. But I was wrong, she pleaded. I see you now. I see who you really are. No, I corrected you. See my bank account. You see the villa. You see the private jet. You do not see a father. You see an ATM code. I have a staff of 5 who are paid. Very well. I continued, my voice cold and final. My chef has a Michelin star. My housekeeper has been with me for 10 years. They possess something you never will: integrity. But I am family, she cried, her voice cracking. I am your daughter-in-law. You are a parasite, I said. I do not need a housekeeper, and I certainly do not need the kind of rat that jumps off a sinking ship the moment its feet get wet. But Dad, do not call me Dad, I interrupted. You chose your side, Courtney. You chose the flash over the substance. You chose the con man over the honest man. Now you have to live in the dark with the choices you made. I am filing for divorce, she screamed, her desperation turning into anger. Good, I said. Stay with your husband, or leave him. It does not matter to me. Watch him rot or rot with him. But do not ever call this number again. You are not welcome in my home. You are not welcome in my life. I pulled the phone away from my ear. Dad, wait! She screamed, her voice tinny and small against the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean. I tapped the red button, ending the call, then I tapped block, ensuring her voice would never pollute my peace again. I placed the phone face down on the table. The silence returned to the terrace, accompanied only by the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs below and the wind rustling through the olive trees. It was the sound of absolute victory. I picked up my wine and toasted the sunset. The past was dead and buried in a social housing project in America. The future was golden, and it belonged entirely to me. The sun began its slow descent into the Atlantic, turning the horizon into a bruised line of purple and gold. I sat on the terrace of my villa, the silence of the evening disturbed only by the rhythmic crashing of waves against the cliffs below. For the first time in 30 years, my mind was quiet. There were no schedules to keep, no trucks to route, no family crises to manage, just the vast indifference of the ocean and the glass of wine in my hand. My tablet chimed a soft, singular note that cut through the tranquility. It was not a call, and it was not a plea for money. It was a notification from the private investigator I had kept on retainer in New York. I had given him one final instruction before I left the country. I wanted to know where they landed. I did not want to help them. I did not want to save them. I simply wanted to know the final trajectory of the crash. I picked up the tablet and unlocked it with a thumbprint. A single high-resolution image filled the screen, followed by a brief report. I stared at the photo for a long time, the pixels forming a picture that was both tragic and perfectly poetic. The image was taken through the glass facade of an office building in downtown Manhattan. It was night, and the lobby was empty, save for a solitary figure pushing a yellow mop bucket across the polished marble floor. The man was wearing a gray jumpsuit that was slightly too large for his frame. His shoulders were slumped in exhaustion, his head bowed as he worked a mop back and forth in a rhythm of resignation. It was Terrence. I zoomed in on the image. Looking at his face, he had lost weight. His cheeks were hollow, and he had a scruffy beard that spoke of a lack of grooming. But what struck me most was his eyes. They were focused on the floor, focused on the dirt, focused on the task at hand. There was no arrogance left in them, no entitlement, just the dull acceptance of survival. I scrolled down to the investigator. S report. Terrence had been unemployed for 4 months after the scandal. He had applied to every financial firm in the city. But his name was toxic. No one would trust a man who had been arrested for fraud and theft of services with their money. Desperation had set in. The rent on his studio apartment was due, and he had nowhere left to turn. So he had applied for a job with a commercial cleaning service, a night shift position that paid minimum wage and offered no benefits. It was the kind of job he used to mock the kind of job he said was beneath his dignity, the kind of job he thought I did. I looked back at the photo at the logo embroidered on the left breast of his gray jumpsuit. It was a blue anchor inside a circle, the corporate logo of the cleaning contractor. But then I looked at the background at the wall behind him. Etched into the marble of the lobby wall in large brass letters were the words, Freeman Logistics, Global Headquarters. The irony hit me with the force of a physical blow. Terrence was not just a janitor, he was a janitor in my building. He was scrubbing the floors of the empire he could have inherited. He was cleaning the shoe prints of the executives who worked for me. He did not know Freeman Logistics was a holding company, a massive conglomerate with hundreds of subsidiaries. The cleaning contract was handled by a third-party vendor. Terrence had no idea that every time he dipped that mop into the bucket, he was working for his father. He had no idea that the building he was entering every night was the physical manifestation of the seed, money he had torn up. I felt a lump form in my throat, not of sadness, but of a strange, heavy closure. The universe has a sense of humor, I thought, and it is dark and it is precise. I closed the image and opened my contacts list. I scrolled past the blocked numbers of my ex-wife and former daughter-in-law until I found the number for Marcus Sterling, the Director of Human Resources for my North American operations. I pressed the call button. The line rang twice before he answered. "Mr. Freeman, sir," Marcus said, his voice surprised and alert. "It is late in New York. Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine." "Marcus," I said, my voice steady, "I am looking at the personnel roster for the contracted cleaning staff at headquarters, specifically the night shift." There was a pause, the sound of typing in the background. "Yes, sir, I have it here. Is there a problem with the service? Do we need to terminate the contract?" "No," I said, watching a seagull dive toward the water. "I want to ask about a specific employee, a new hire named Terrence Freeman." The typing stopped. "I see him, sir," Marcus said slowly. "Freeman. Is that a relation, sir? I did not realize." "He is my son," I stated flatly. There was a long, uncomfortable silence on the line. Marcus was a good man, a loyal employee, but this was a situation that was outside the employee handbook. "Sir, I am so sorry," Marcus stammered. "If he is your son, why is he mopping the floors? I can have him transferred immediately. We can find him a position in data entry, or perhaps in the mailroom somewhere more suitable." "No," I interrupted, my voice hard as iron. "You will do no such thing." "Sir, Terrence Freeman stays exactly where he is," I commanded. "He stays on the night shift. He stays on the mop and bucket. He receives minimum wage and not a penny more. He gets no special treatment, no extra breaks, and no promotions." I took a breath, letting the salt air fill my lungs. "And Marcus, this is the most important part. He must never know that I own the building. He must never know that I intervened. He must never know that he is working for me. Do you understand?" "I think so, sir," Marcus said, though he sounded confused. "If he is late, you write him up," I continued. "If he does a poor job, you reprimand him. If he steals, you fire him and call the police. Treat him like every other employee who starts at the bottom, because that is where he is, at the bottom." "But Sir," Marcus asked gently. "Why?" "Because I tried to give him the elevator and he broke it," I said, looking at the photo of my son one last time. "Now he has to take the stairs." I understood what I was doing. It was a punishment, yes, but it was also a gift, the only gift I had left to give him. I was giving him the opportunity to learn the value of $1 the hard way. I was giving him the chance to build character through sweat and aching muscles. I was giving him the reality check he had avoided his entire life. Maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10, he would look at those marble floors and understand what it took to build them. Maybe he would learn respect. Maybe he would become a man, or maybe he would quit in a week and blame the world for his failures. That was up to him. I was done carrying him. "Understood, sir," Marcus said, his voice regaining its professional edge. "He will be treated like everyone else." "Thank you, Marcus," I said. And Marcus, "Yes, sir. Make sure the floors are spotless." I hung up the phone and set the tablet down on the table. The sun had dipped below the horizon, now leaving the sky a canvas of deep indigo and violet. The stars were beginning to appear pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Not the secure satellite phone I used for business, but my old personal cell phone, the one with the cracked screen, the one that held the history of my former life. It was a physical archive of pain. It held the text messages from Dolores complaining about money. It held the voicemails from Terrence asking for loans. It held the photos of a family that never really existed. I unlocked it one last time, scrolling through the messages. "Dad, please call me Lucius. You owe me, Grandpa. Are you there?" I looked at the names, the dates, the desperate pleas of people who only knew how to take. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel hate. I felt a profound sense of release. The cord was cut. The anchor was raised. I stood up and walked to the edge of the terrace. The cliff dropped away into the darkness, the sound of the ocean, a constant roar below. I held the phone out over the abyss, feeling the cool metal against my palm. It was heavy with memories, heavy with ghosts. "Goodbye," I whispered. I opened my hand and let it go. The phone tumbled through the air, end over end, a small black stone falling into the sea. It disappeared into the white foam, swallowed by the Atlantic, gone forever. I stood there for a moment, listening to the waves, watching the spot where my past had vanished. I felt a lightness in my chest, a physical sensation of expansion, as if I could finally breathe deeply for the first time in decades. Footsteps sounded behind me, soft and purposeful against the stone tiles. I turned around. Standing in the doorway of the villa was Elena. She was wearing a white silk dress that caught the moonlight, her silver hair shining like a halo. She held 2 glasses of wine in her hands, her eyes warm and knowing. Elena was not a model. She was not 20 years younger than me. She was my age, a retired corporate attorney. I had met 6 months ago in Lisbon. She knew about my money, but she had her own. She knew about my past, but she did not judge it. She loved me for the conversation, for the silence, for the man I was when the suit came off. She walked toward me, crossing the terrace with a grace that came from confidence. She handed me a glass of wine, her fingers brushing mine. "Is it done?" she asked, looking at the empty space in my hand where the phone had been. "It is done," I said, taking the wine. She did not ask about Terrence. She did not ask about Dolores. She knew the story, she knew the pain, and she knew that tonight was about closing the book. She turned toward the ocean, leaning against the railing, her shoulder touching mine. "It is a beautiful night," she said. "It is." I agreed, looking at her, looking at the woman who saw me not as a truck driver or a billionaire, but as Lucius. She raised her glass, a silent invitation, a toast to the unknown, to what she asked. Smiling, I looked at the dark water, then at the stars, then at her. I thought about the mop bucket in New York. I thought about the social housing in the industrial district. I thought about the empty mansion and the shredded check. I thought about the man who had walked out of the service entrance and never looked back. I raised my glass, the crystal chiming softly against hers. "To freedom," I said. "To freedom," she echoed. We drank the wine, rich and complex, tasting of earth and sun and time. The wind picked up, rustling the olive trees in the garden, carrying the scent of the sea and the promise of a new day. I was 68 years old. I had lost a family, but I had found a life. And as I stood there on the edge of the continent with a woman who loved me and a future that was entirely my own, I knew that the truck driver had finally delivered his last load. He was home. The screen fades to black, leaving only the sound of the ocean and the feeling of absolute, unshakable peace. Through the wreckage of what I once called family, I learned that true wealth is never found in a bank account, but in the integrity of the soul. My son and ex-wife chased the shimmer of gold and fell into the abyss of their own greed, proving that character cannot be bought, only built through the sweat of honest labor. I discovered that sometimes the greatest act of love is not to save people from their mistakes, but to let them face the consequences. Walking away was not an act of abandonment. It was an act of self-preservation. I found that dignity is the only currency that never devaluates, and peace is the only luxury worth fighting for. If you believe that respect must be earned and never bought, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice. And tell me in the comments, would you have torn up the check or would you have given them a second chance?